The Way of Initiation, Ancient and Modern. Pekka Ervast. Translated by Antti Savinainen. Edited by Tim Wyatt. Introduction. This is a deeply Christian book, but not in the way the vast majority of Christians regard their religion. Pekka Ervast presents us with alternative types of Christianity, cosmic, mystical, and esoteric, which predates the appearance of Jesus. His central messages is one of redemption via the Christ Spirit, which he vehemently asserts has finally the power to heal and rejuvenate a wounded world. Indeed, he insists that this Spirit is the only way of achieving this. He portrays the story of Christ as a powerfully divine and symbolic process of release from materiality and the lower self. And yet he is not uncritical of the Christianity of his day, accusing it of spiritual laziness. This book is based on lectures Ervast delivered in the immediate aftermath of World War I, as people attempted to explain or rationalize the carnage and slaughter of what was history's first fully mechanized armed conflict. Although very different from today, the zeitgeist of a century ago does bear some striking similarities to the modern world, characterized by decadence, decline, and decay. Ervast's recipe for spiritual redemption remains as relevant today as it did back then. He has left us with a highly readable and relevant legacy in which spiritual aspirants can progressively triumph over the mundanities, obstacles, and absurdities of everyday life. He belonged to that important second generation of theosophists who successfully coaxed out and reinterpreted core ideas from the voluminous, influential, but sometimes obscure writings of Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, especially her magnum opus The Secret Doctrine. He closely weaves core theosophical themes such as cycles, reincarnation, and karma into this compelling narrative. Employing the same occult cosmogony and anthropology as Blavatsky, Ervast presents us with a cogent yet concise history of human spiritual evolution and unfolding consciousness. He asserts that humanity's long evolution began not here on Earth, but in a previous moon-based system. He charts the progress of root races and the immense changes to humans' physical makeup and ascent of consciousness during the Third, the Lemurian, and the Fourth, the Atlantean periods. During the current Fifth Indo-Aryan era, Ervast details how shifts in consciousness have constantly morphed, always impacting on the way individuals achieve initiation and admittance to other worlds. He demonstrates the stark differences in initiation during the times of what he calls the Old Covenant, which preceded Jesus, and the New Covenant which now prevails. In the old days, initiates were fierce, unforgiving warriors fueled by bloodlust, while those of the modern era display more benign and refined characteristics. Like writers before him, Ervast stresses that all spiritual progress involves intense struggle and strife, always beset with painful obstacles. The spiritual seeker must choose to be a homeless wanderer. The path to initiation and redemption is always a lonely one, says Ervast, and can only be achieved by embracing the Christ principle. He offers a systematic and highly practical pathway to recognize and embrace that principle in order to forge a divine connection with the higher self. He describes Christ as the higher self of the earth spirit. Another key message for the aspirant is that any kind of spiritual ascendancy necessarily involves abandoning and then severing connections with the lower self along with its temptations, entanglements, and entrapments. Ervast also delves into the nature, purpose, and use of two of those mysterious forces mentioned in Oriental esoteric literature, Kundalini and Prana. He warns of the immense dangers of Kundalini, the serpent power associated with sex being prematurely released. However, he does conclude, sexual power is now the Holy Spirit in us. There is a deep honesty and integrity embedded in Ervast's words. It is clear that he was a man of integrity, conviction, and dedication, focused on his mission to communicate ageless truths to a world hungry to hear them, a timeless wisdom which can never be subsumed by the transitory and fashionable ideas of any era. He was one of a long line of messengers appointed to repurpose and transmit the secret doctrine of the ages at times when needed. The success of his endeavors can be measured by the fact that his words still ring clear and true, despite a century of the most profound change the world has ever seen. This book is practical rather than theoretical, and displays both a passion and urgency to transcend the immediate material world and connect with the universal spirit of Godhead. Tim Wyatt, December 14th, 2025, Bingley, West Yorkshire, England. Man, know thyself. The phrase "know thyself" is familiar to all of us from ancient cultures. The Greek philosopher Socrates always told his students, "Nothise auton," know thyself, and even if in our everyday lives we do not regard the phrase in such a philosophical sense, even if we do not remember it and think about it, we can still say that our daily existence in society is built on that phrase. This is because, from a practical viewpoint, it is necessary for us to know ourselves, at least to some extent, and to know our abilities and skills so that we can participate in life and get along. Alongside true self-knowledge, there is always some recognition from the world. But even if that self-knowledge is based to some extent on appreciation from the world, we can also see people who know themselves before the world knows them. And this rule must hold: one must know oneself before the world does. One must be aware of this, and create an understanding of the world accordingly. Self-knowledge thus becomes manifest in practical life. Jesus refers to self-knowledge in the Gospel when he takes the example of the king. Or suppose a king is about to go to war against another king. Won't he first sit down and consider whether he is able with 10,000 men to oppose the one coming against him with 20,000? Luke 14:31. Jesus is suggesting that self-knowledge is essential in everyday life. However, as Socrates says, and as it has been understood in all ancient cultures, self-knowledge has not meant this practical self-awareness, but has run much deeper. It has been self-knowledge which we always put into a human context. Human, know thyself. It is not, therefore, the kind of self-knowledge that we could apply to a profession: carpenter, know thyself; writer, know thyself, etc. This is a philosophical quality distinct from everyday self-awareness. It is directed at every human. In other words, knowing oneself means knowing who you are, what your human life is, and what it is to be human. The real philosophical self-knowledge in question is of this general quality, which is common to every human being. And at the same time, it is the most intrinsic question of all. Everyone can say to oneself, "I am a carpenter only outwardly, a writer outwardly, a king outwardly. Inwardly, I am only a human." And what does it mean that I am a human being? Nowadays, not everyone will ask themselves this question without further ado. There are, of course, some people who from childhood onwards have been pondering great questions in their minds, who do not take life so naturally, who do not necessarily adapt themselves to existing conditions, but who, with searching, inquiring eyes, look at existing conditions, at life around them, wondering and asking questions. These are the people who are born seekers of truth, who are marked by fate with the mark of Cain, who cannot find peace in everyday circumstances, who are always searching, who experience pain, and finally, if their search in childhood, in youth, has been more of a wondering, they come to the clear conclusion: but I am really seeking the truth. I want to know what life is. People who do not ask these questions may sometimes wonder in later life, what am I? What have I come into this world for? What does it all mean? Is there a God? Is there anything else but this life? Is this all it boils down to? Is this just the daily hustle and bustle? This is the way I think every human being, at least in passing, sometimes poses these questions, and some people constantly ponder these questions and become truth seekers. When do you ask yourself these questions in your daily life? When life no longer follows the rosy ways of childhood and early youth, but when one is confronted with disappointment, sadness, or some unpleasant discovery about oneself. When a person becomes aware of their sinfulness, as they say in religious circles here in Christendom, when one becomes aware of inner contradictions, then one awakens to wonder. As long as his life goes smoothly and without significant adversity, the superficial person will not wonder. But when a bump or a chasm comes along, or a loved one dies or abandons or betrays one, then one stops to wonder, what is this life really about? It is above all about that contradiction within, that sense of sin which comes so naturally in our Christianity, for we have been brought up from childhood to understand evil in ourselves as sin. When we realize that there is a vice, a weakness in us, then it is natural that here in Christendom we should think of sin, but we must remember that we do not impose that requirement on the followers of other religions. They call those things by different names. Many Christians are horrified that other religions don't know about contrition. On the contrary, we should understand others. Perhaps they have something similar within them. Maybe they say, "I am so ignorant, so unevolved, there is so much animal in me." Here in Christendom we call it a sense of sin, and we can each make the psychological observation that we can feel that sense of sin. We see it as an ideal by which we should live and be. But that ideal is not so enchanting, so beautiful, so exclusively attractive to us in Christendom. It is more like a reproachful, harsh legal injunction. It is like a judge saying, "See now how bad you are and how far you have fallen. This is how you must be if you are to obey God's law. You have fallen into sin and are beyond help unless there is someone to save you from sin, for the root of sin has come into you through one human, through the original human." Guilt is a strange feeling. It tells us that we should have been different. We should have had a chance to be better. But we have missed that chance. Therefore, we must pray and hope to regain the perfection we have lost. This is the case in Christianity. In another religion, one may think, "I have not yet reached perfection. I must be born many times into the world to reach it." Many in Christendom have pointed out that such an assumption leads to laziness. But have we then really been so diligent? I don't think so. Our efforts have been directed more to the external culture than to the inner human being. Of course, there has also been an inner effort, but we have not paid so much attention to it because in Christianity we have thought that we cannot do it on our own. If we are truth seekers and thinkers, and if we pay more attention to these inner feelings of sin, fear, and insecurity, which are connected with existence itself, then when we reason, when we think, we don't want to be shocked but to understand life. When we don't take into account prejudices and teachings but go within ourselves, then we must say, "As a seeker after truth, I must think for myself whether I am lost or whether I can understand life except by seeking help elsewhere. Or is there within me the possibility of salvation, as is believed in the East?" How is this? When someone has become a seeker of truth, then they can undoubtedly reach various conclusions. If one starts from perfectly natural grounds, if one thinks logically, one will say, "Can there be more than one life in the universe? Can there be more than one existing life?" And one must admit, there cannot be. There can be any number of millions of forms of living beings in this world, but if we think of life itself, of existence, then we must say there cannot be more than one existence. There can be only one existence even if it manifests itself in a million different ways. Perhaps that is what all religions and people of faith mean when they talk about God. For what is God? God is the one who is behind everything, the unifying principle in everything. So, are there many gods? No, there can only be one God in this sense. And if we, as seekers after truth, were afraid of this word God, if we did not want to use any of the old religious concepts and names, we would use the words life or existence. And we would say there can be only one existence, only one life. What then will we all be? What then is all this manifested life, all the life we see, all the life we perceive? What can it be but the manifestation of that one life? It is as if that one life were cut up into thousands of millions of pieces. All are like drops in a great ocean of infinity. All forms are ephemeral, but life is one, life remains. Even though the ocean is made up of an infinite number of drops, it is still one. So is that great, absolute, infinite and eternal life, in which there is always balance and peace which nothing can ever touch. Forms are born, live and die. Whatever upheavals may occur in the manifested world, existence itself cares nothing for it. Stars are lit and extinguished, millions of centuries and millennia pass, eternities pass, but infinite life remains intact. Absolute existence is one. We must acknowledge this and tell ourselves, we too, as human beings, are manifestations of that absolute existence, children of that absolute divinity, if we dare to use that word. We are children of that absolute. When we think like this, when this truth is revealed to us, we already feel a boundless, infinite pity for ourselves and everyone. Everything seems so wistful, so utterly sad. We do not yet know anything else. We have only known the truth that we are all children of the absolute, and it fills us with deep sadness. How wonderfully insignificant, small and empty everything is. For a little while we humans live here. For a little while we flap our wings and then we languish in the grave. Then at least we fade into that great being. That's certain as soon as we see the truth of that wondrous life. How small is our existence. So why should we be mean and nasty to each other, harsh and judgmental? Why not let every human being try their best and be themselves? Such compassion for the whole of existence fills us up, when without prejudice we have been able to come to the great truth that there is only one existence, Then we wistfully and sadly bow down before it. This is a very important psychological experience for any seeker of truth. One must achieve this sublime compassion and pity. One cannot advance on any occult way unless one has first gone through this initiation of compassion, how small and insignificant we are in the great cosmic sea. Then, having undergone this remarkable awakening, we say to ourselves, can we not know more of that life, that existence? And when we again encounter evil in ourselves and in others, our heart hurts as if it were being burned with hot, fiery irons, and we ask ourselves, is it not possible that we could know more, for we do not yet understand everything? We felt, when we went through that initiation of compassion, that there was no evil. For what is evil? It is nothing but a shadow of light, and this must be logically true for the simple reason that in absolute life there can be nothing but harmony. It must be either wholly good or wholly evil. What is the difference between good and evil? Evil, which must be in harmony with itself, is then also good. We must change our definition of evil by holding to one absolute life in which there can be nothing out of harmony. So, evil is apparent, good is the only real thing in that great life. We must call it good from our point of view. That life is so great and high that it is above our definition of good and evil, but we must add, harmony has all the chief marks of good. But even if we have reasoned this way, when we come to deal with evil, the problem is still before us. We cannot conceive that evil exists in so great a degree in this existence unless there is some remedy. Why is it that another person is sick from the cradle to the grave, or a person loses their health in a war, for example? How can we human beings be so mean, terrible and cruel to each other so that, for example, we commit wars even if there is no redemption or purpose? We are all sentient beings who may suffer terribly. Therefore we are not comforted, even if our reason says it is the truth. We are not comforted by the idea of absolute life. We want to know why there is so much evil, so much suffering in physical life. We remember what the religions have said. There is a great covenant of reconciliation, that an individual being lives after death, and that one as an individual being is born many times into the world and has another life apart from this physical one. Yes, if there were something like that, then we could understand life. And why should it not be so? Asks a voice within us. Examine yourself more, and then you will also come to know more about God and the mystery of life. Don't be satisfied with religions, but examine yourself. What are the basic qualities you have as a conscious being? And since you have come from this one life, those same basic qualities must also be in that infinite life. For there can be nothing in you that is not in that absolute life. Since there is only one life, there must be small parts of what is in that one life. So, examine yourself, and take heed of the words of the Apostle Paul. The Spirit searches all things, even the deep things of God. 1 Corinthians 2:10. And when you examine yourself, when you examine what basic abilities and qualities you have, then you will understand that those same qualities exist in the great life. When one examines oneself, one finds that one has a consciousness. I am a conscious being, says the human. My basic quality is consciousness. What is that consciousness? It is the capacity to be aware of something else, of the environment, the capacity to receive impressions, perceptions, and observations. That's the basic property of consciousness. That's when consciousness is alive, taking in information. If I am consciousness, I am like a vessel that can be filled, and I am aware of what is poured into it. So, the great life of the universe must also be conscious. Indeed, there could be no consciousness in me if the great Absolute did not have it. Only a short-sighted materialist, who cannot explain anything, who does not believe in any greater life in this sense, can say, I have learned, I have become wise. Life itself is the effect of blind forces in the universe. And he does not realize how proud, how narrow-minded and sullen he is. He condemns all existence as low and ignorant. He is king, he decides things. We must then kindly, gently, with a compassionate smile say, if you think of reason so highly, has your reason been born out of nothing? Have you created it? Who are you? We must say that if the materialist is a rational, intelligent thinker, then that logical intelligence, that ability to think must exist in the great life itself and to a much greater degree. Where else would it have come from in a materialist? A materialist should admit that nothing can come out of nothing. That's basic mathematics we should all know and understand, no matter how materialistic we are. Therefore, since nothing comes from nothing, all that there is has come from perfection, from richness, and only a small portion of it has been revealed. If I, as well as a materialist, can say to myself that I'm a small part of a great life and I'm rational, then there must be reason in life behind all this existence. And so, when one sees and realizes that one is a conscious being, then one must say, consciousness is a fundamental property of the great absolute life. There must be consciousness on a scale and in a quantity of which we cannot have the slightest idea. Similarly, one admits that one has reason. Then the truth seeker adds, there must be reason in infinite measure in the great life. Moreover, since I have memory, there must be an infinite amount of memory in the great life. In other words, the truth seeker understands that this great memory of existence is a kind of omniscience, an eternal knowledge of everything, an ever-present knowledge of the past. And who knows, it may also be knowledge of the present and the future. Thus, that great absolute life, which at first we did not want to call God, then acquires such characteristics as to make it God in our eyes. That great existence necessarily becomes God, the perfection of all the basic qualities. We ourselves have those basic qualities in a small measure. In each of us, there is a desire to express ourselves. It is the essence of all our desires and lusts. However bad, however sinful, however weak we may be, we have that basic desire to express ourselves. We feel that we must express ourselves even in evil. We can, of course, suppress that desire, but we feel as if we are doing violence to ourselves. And if there is nothing in our lives in which we are free to express ourselves, then we feel lacking. And because this desire is in us, there is also in the great divinity that enormous, invincible desire to express itself. That is the deepest cause of all creation, of all manifestation. If God had no desire to manifest himself, why would anything exist? God, no more than we, cannot have any other rational reason for manifesting himself. It must therefore be a great, mighty desire to be. As stated in an ancient Hindu text, the fundamental quality of divinity is kama, or love. Even our lust and desire, all our small and evil qualities, are love at the deepest level. It is the divine love, the great desire that is in God. When we examine ourselves and discover what wonderful basic qualities there are in the great life, that life gradually becomes God to us. And then we discover the purpose and reason for our existence. The purpose of our lives is then to an ever greater extent embodying that very hidden life of the divine. It is in us and through us that this existence seeks to manifest itself. God lives in us and wants to manifest himself through us. Thus, this definition now takes on a whole new dimension. We are all children of the Absolute, parts of the great, unique life. This new definition, as stated in our Christian faith, is that when we understand who we are, we recognize that the human being is the Son of God, and God is his Father. So, our purpose, the goal of our lives, is that we may all stand as self-conscious sons of God before the Father of infinity, who is then one with us. And then, when we have understood this, we also understand that existence is not hopeless in the sense that it has left us to our own devices, but that life itself has arranged it so that we can reach that goal. It has arranged reincarnation, life after death, existence in this visible world as a school or a field of experience for us. In this wheel of reincarnation we gradually learn. We do not become aware of our divinity by resting in the natural world, but only by our own will, and precisely because we are sons of God and manifestations of the great life. We must will ourselves towards that goal, for will is also one of our fundamental qualities, and wonderful is the goal that awaits us. For one of our basic characteristics is also choice. We can choose between good and evil. We all know from experience that our choices are limited from the start. We can only choose slavishly, we are not free. But we understand that this capacity for choice, which is within each of us and which makes us responsible beings, exists perfectly in absolute life. And what is its name there? Its name is total freedom. What a wonder God is, and what a magnificent life in divinity. God is necessity itself, desire itself, love that wants to exist, and yet God is perfectly free. It is a mystery to us how we can combine these two things. Like all wise sages, Jesus Christ has also said, "The truth will set you free." John 8:32. This means that when we become sons of God, as He is, then we will be free from all things. And we see how each individual's life unfolds in everyday experiences. This is not empty talk. Our daily experience proves that the human self is expanding. A child's consciousness is still small. It is more a consciousness of its own body, of a little personality, but that consciousness does not perceive other people except from the outside. However, as one ages and has a family, one's consciousness comes to grasp that family. Not only is one a mere individual, but within one lives all the family members. And then one's consciousness can expand to encompass a whole nation. Since the French Revolution, a national consciousness has developed among people in Europe, a love of the fatherland that was previously impossible in Christendom. Before the Great Revolution, there was no concept of patriotism. The French did not have a homeland, there was only France. People who lived in a small village didn't know about the rest of the world. That village was their homeland because if they tried to go elsewhere, they could not do so without being restricted by various regulations. A person belonging to the upper classes, who had the opportunity to travel, knew of their country only as France, which they loved more than other countries, but they did not feel that France was a great human whole. But now, a sense of patriotism has developed. A consciousness has arisen that there is one wonderful country which is not only a country, but at the same time embraces a people whom I can love and understand, with whom I am one. If I travel abroad, the image of my own country lives in my consciousness as the most beautiful I have, and the people of my country live in my consciousness as brothers and sisters who feel as I do. In a foreign country, I cannot feel so united with the people as I do with my people. Therefore, a greater consciousness has now opened up in humanity. We are moving upwards, and the ideal towards which we are moving is the great love, the consciousness, the awareness that encompasses everything, all humanity, all living beings, the whole cosmos. That is the goal. That is certainly what we are moving towards. Let us continue our journey on initiation mysteries. The topic I plan to talk about today sounds somewhat mysterious. I am sure that all of you have heard that initiation is discussed in connection with Freemasonry, and you might well ask whether the speaker is now going to tell us something about the secrets of Freemasonry, and whether he is going to reveal to us, illegally, something that otherwise must be kept secret. To this, I will immediately reply that I have no intention of doing so. I am not going to talk about the concept of initiation in the context of Freemasonry, but I want to say something about it in a broader sense because we must not forget that in the theosophical literature, we talk about initiation, initiates, ordainers, etc. in mysticism, occultism, medieval alchemy, Kabbalistic endeavors, and modern Rosicrucianism. There is talk of initiation and initiates. Therefore, this concept is very common because we know that the phrases initiation and consecrator are used in everyday language. Let us talk about marriage initiations, and let us talk about initiations to the Master Mason degree, not to mention the possibility of being ordained as a member of a mysterious fraternity. We are used to understanding it as a kind of celebration in which something happens to the individual concerned. What strikes us most of all is that such an initiation ceremony links the initiate to a new circle of brothers or sisters. Just think of marriage. There, two people are married into a new order, and they form a family. They belong to a family circle. They no longer have the same freedoms and rights as human beings as before. Now they have a different set of freedoms, perhaps more limited, and a different set of rights, perhaps greater. They have been brought into a new circle. In the same way, in academic circles, a candidate for a master's degree is admitted to the circle of scholars through an initiation ceremony. After that, one can continue their studies to become a professor or any high scholar. In that initiation ceremony, one has entered the fraternity of scholars. It is the same with a person initiated as a Mason. He now belongs to a fraternity to which he did not belong before, a circle with its own duties, its own secrets, its own rights and obligations. These things are common knowledge. But when we think a little more about this kind of initiation, we see a lot more. We see that there is not only the ceremony of initiation, but also mysteries that concern only the one being initiated. We could say that the fact that the person being ordained becomes a member of a new circle of people through a certain ceremony is one of those mysteries. But that does not exhaust the matter. It is not the only mystery. If we think, for example, of the master's academic degree, that ceremony which makes the candidate a master is at the same time a stamp which is given to one, a stamp which shows and proves that one has certain knowledge. The master's degree is not conferred as a title of honor, as for example the degree of doctor may be conferred on an otherwise meritorious person. Only a person who has completed the prescribed studies and examinations may be ordained to a master's academic degree. That initiation marks one out as someone who possesses knowledge, and at the same time opens the way to the acquisition of more extensive knowledge in a perfectly legitimate order. When we think about initiation, we discover a third mystery. This mystery is most evident in marriage. The third mystery is that initiation makes possible the expansion of the initiate's consciousness. In marriage, the two people involved expand their consciousness. What is that expansion of consciousness? It is that one's consciousness has expanded to include another individual so intimately that it has, in a sense, brought about an expansion of one's own personal consciousness. When a person loves another person, their own consciousness encloses that other person within themselves. This has happened precisely through love. Now, when those two people get married, it is like a pledge that their consciousness will continue to expand and will include the family. This means that they are no longer free individuals who can do whatever they want. Now that they have expanded their consciousness to include the family, they have taken on some responsibility. They are responsible for making sure that the family gets along in this world. Their consciousness encompasses the other individuals in the family and their responsibilities to them. In brief, we can say that initiation is a threefold mystery. First, one is received into some brotherhood. Second, initiation is a testimony and a stamp that knowledge has been acquired. And third, that consciousness has been expanded, and that the expansion of consciousness is still to take place. In these everyday initiations, these three mysteries are not clearly revealed, but these three mysteries do exist if you think more carefully about individual cases. When we then look at the question of initiation from a higher perspective, it is very important for us to remember these three aspects. For as the saying goes, everything that happens here on earth is only a shadow and reflection of some higher light, some higher truth. It is said, for example, in the Catholic Church, that when a human marriage ceremony is performed, the marriage actually takes place in heaven. That beautiful idea suggests that what happens here on earth is always a reflection of a higher reality. Therefore, it is not at all alien to our reason and our inner intuition when we read in literature that there have always been initiations in some very special, high, miraculous sense. Even if we do not belong to the Catholic Church, we hear in the Protestant Church that there is some wonderful congregation of holy people, an invisible church of which this visible church is only a metaphor. It is composed of true believers, Christians deeply committed to their faith. We will learn, and we will then understand that indeed if one is truly holy, and if one is steadfast in one's faith, one is a very special individual. Such believers are not to be found everywhere. They can be here and there on earth. They form a secret holy congregation, an invisible church. This is what we realize in our souls. It is not a long step from that conception to the idea we get from theosophy and all mystery science, that there really is such a secret brotherhood, an invisible congregation of holy people, an invisible church. It is made up of people who are much more experienced, much more knowledgeable, much more skilled in the art of living than we have conceived when we have thought of the Church of Holy Christians. We can now, as theosophists, clearly understand that there is a secret brotherhood composed of people of infinitely high attainments. At the same time, we have heard that it is not easy to become a member of that secret brotherhood. You cannot enter it unless you have done extensive self-education and have developed it to the point of adeptship. That wonderful brotherhood exists here on earth, we are told, but we don't know its members. To know the members of that brotherhood, we ourselves would have to belong to that brotherhood. Only brothers know each other. We can only guess that someone might belong to it. This brotherhood is made up of people who are not only such physical, corporeal beings, but also live freely in another invisible world. Their inner soul body is so organized, their glorified heavenly body already so formed, that they may hold meetings wherever the brethren physically reside. They may hold meetings in the invisible world at an appointed time, as in some Rosicrucian brotherhoods, when it was said that on such and such a day the brethren were to assemble in the holy temple. As the brothers were in their own countries, it would have been very difficult to travel long distances for the meeting scheduled for a particular night. It would have been impossible for them to travel from Europe to Asia, for example, as there were no modern means of transport. The order that they should all meet together on a particular night would have been impossible to carry out if those brothers had not been human beings who could travel in a completely different way, who were self-conscious in another body, and who were therefore independent of this physical body, which one actually keeps for humanity, not for oneself. So, we talk in theosophy and occultism about this brotherhood of masters and adepts, and we know that one cannot even become a disciple of such a master unless one receives initiation. One has to be initiated into that brotherhood. The word initiation has thus acquired a very high, deep and mysterious meaning in theosophy. We understand that there can indeed be mysteries in such initiation. The first, of course, is that one is received into the brotherhood and becomes a member of a new circle. The second mystery, that of knowledge, is also comprehensible to us. We also understand that one cannot become a member of such a brotherhood unless one has attained a certain knowledge, unless one has acquired through self-education a knowledge which ordinary people do not have, and this knowledge we are accustomed to call supersensory knowledge. We find that those who are initiated into that secret holy brotherhood know secrets of life and death which the ordinary person does not know at all. They know how to move in the world of the dead. They know how to watch their fate and to study its stages in both the visible and the invisible world. They fully know what death is. They have supersensory capabilities. After all, there are so many facts about supersensible things in our ordinary lives that we do not doubt the possibility of such things. Science has already reached the point where it is certain that human thought can pass from one person to another. Scientific researchers are confident that telepathic phenomena are real. Likewise, those who have studied the subject scientifically have concluded that clairvoyance is a real human ability that allows a person to see independently of the senses even what is happening in another city, as reported in historical events. Swedenborg saw the Great Fire of Stockholm while in Gothenburg, and Apollonius of Tyana, while in Asia Minor, saw the Roman emperor and tyrant murdered in Rome at the very moment it happened. These are historically proven cases. There is also a great deal of evidence of such things in our time. So, clairvoyance is independent of the senses. It can see both into the past and into the future. We are convinced that this prophetic faculty exists, and you all probably have some small experience of clairvoyance. Who hasn't had a dream that they are receiving a letter from someone, and then it arrives during the day? A great many people have experienced exactly this. It is these transcendental experiences that make it not impossible for us to think that people may evolve into adepts. Beings who can be initiated into a secret brotherhood, as if into some superhuman circle. We can believe from our own experience that one may evolve in such a way. As for the third mystery, the expansion of consciousness, we don't doubt that either. It is said that the consciousness of the members of the Great White Brotherhood, those masters and adepts, is so vast that it can encompass thousands of people whose spiritual lives they follow. It can encompass the entire globe. It means that their consciousness lives in all of them, or that all those people live in their consciousness. If a person becomes a disciple of a master, a disciple of a holy brother like that, one enters the heart of the master and lives in it. We have a reflection of that in marriage. When two people love each other, they live in each other's hearts. When a man who has lived a wild life gets a wife he loves and respects, he is changed. What is it that causes him to become a very chaste and moral being? He may be completely reborn. He is an entirely new being. This is because the loving, holy and pure image of his wife lives in his heart. It is present in all his works and actions. And if any temptation comes, it will not work because his wife is with him. In the same way as the relationship of the master to his disciple and the disciple to his master. All disciples come into the heart of the master, and the master is aware of them all. Every disciple has the image of the master in their heart. Disciples live before the eyes of the master, so temptations and weaknesses do not work on them. It is like some mysterious, heavenly, miraculous marriage. It is heavenly, for it takes no expression in this visible world. This expansion of consciousness also becomes clear to us from our own experience, if we have had a so-called religious awakening. That's what many people experience. It is by no means only theosophists and the like who experience it. It is, in fact, even more so with those people of faith who experience it. In our Christianity, there is a large number of believers who have had an inner experience, an awakening, or whatever they want to call it. And this awakening, this rebirth, has expanded their consciousness. The rebirth or awakening in religion is that consciousness. Previously it was broken, only looking at and understanding the many contradictory forces in the human soul. These forces pulled here and there, and when looking into their soul one saw nothing but a mosaic pattern, which caused one to have no peace, for one force was pulling one this way and that, while one was struggling and searching to expand this consciousness. Then one suddenly sees the light which unites all these forces and the different parts of oneself. If before one saw only the different colors, now one sees the white light which unites all the colors. One now attains peace and unity in diversity. Such is religious awakening when it is real. I'm not talking about hysteria. There may be hysterical outbursts and emotional expressions, but a true religious awakening is always the attainment of peace, the attainment of a new reconciliatory communion with God. Any religiously experienced person knows that consciousness can expand and become intensely spiritual. It is as if a new will has been awakened in an individual, which is peculiarly moral. Conscience takes over. If previously one tried to act rationally, but reason said one thing at one time and another at another, one now acts according to one's conscience. It is therefore an expansion of human consciousness. Such an experience makes it possible for one to understand that this consciousness may well expand into something quite divine, and that the consciousness of those adepts and masters who are perfect people, who form that secret brotherhood, is so vast, so great, so sacred and so sublime, so beautiful and so intensely moral, that nothing lowly can fit into it. These things we can well comprehend. But then comes the question, how is such an initiation achievable? When we, the people, hear about such a thing, we are then given the opportunity to experience and know. And then it is usual that when one directs one's thoughts and hopes to these high facts of initiation, one's attention is attracted to the mysteries which belong to initiation, but this can easily make one fall. I would now like to describe the different ways people take when they do not yet have a profound understanding, and the different ways they take when they are on the only true way. If one fixes attention on that mystery of initiation that one is initiated into a brotherhood, one will eventually conclude that one seeks initiation from brotherhoods and seeks in the visible world brotherhoods into which one can be initiated and in whose mysteries one can now partake. Then one wanders from one brotherhood to another. There are many very mysterious brotherhoods here on earth. Masonic orders are the most innocent of all. They are secretive, but at least you can learn a lot about them. You can know what is good about them and where they may have gone wrong. The aspirant may therefore use their judgment in the case of Freemasons. One can be initiated into one of those Masonic fraternities. Freemasons are quite modern, cultural, and not in any way intimidating. But one can seek out mysterious fraternities of which one knows absolutely nothing and in which one has to take terrible oaths before one can become a member. One may hear of such a brotherhood, and one may become a member of it. If one is a shallow person, and curiosity has led one into such an adventure, one may grow wiser as one grows older and realize that there is much that is vain and empty in the world. For if one is a little more self-conscious, a little more deeply interested, then one expects and demands more from such a brotherhood. Eventually one meets a fraternity like that, one that really does have some pretty amazing secrets to share. One is initiated into a secret circle after exacting vows, given some amazing information, taught extraordinary skills, and one feels satisfied. One becomes immersed in it all. But what can be one's fate? One may have a moment of light when one asks oneself, but where is all this going? What does it all mean? Maybe one will find out that in that secret brotherhood there is a very far-reaching, mysterious purpose to all this. We are changing the world, not in the way that ordinary revolutions do, but we are changing the world in a mysterious way. We are quietly accomplishing a lot. But one may have bright moments when one thinks, this is more than the work of a devilish evil spirit. What have I got myself into? Let us then think of a person whose attention is fixed on that other mystery, on knowledge, on the acquisition of knowledge, on the fact that the initiation gives proof that knowledge has been acquired, and secondly, that new possibilities open up for acquiring and increasing knowledge and possibilities, which would not exist without that initiation. One draws attention to this. I want knowledge. I want to gain knowledge of supersensible and mysterious things. There is much talk of the unseen worlds, of the dead, ghosts. I need to get information about them. And since I have heard that knowledge is only attained by developing some faculties within myself, I want to develop such faculties. By asking questions, one tries to find out how to develop these mysterious faculties, how to become clairvoyant, how to learn to move in the invisible world. That is what such a person thinks, and that is what one strives for. One soon realizes that there is old knowledge called asceticism and self-torture. When one uses it, when one denies oneself all pleasures, all natural needs, when one is without food and sleep, when one cares nothing for bodily suffering, then one can experience something. One hears of the fakirs of India who become so much masters of their bodies that they have no pains and that they care nothing for death but say to it, "Keep away," until they themselves voluntarily say, "Now I pass out of this body because I don't want to live anymore." And then these fakirs, in the twinkling of an eye, without disease, pass out of their bodies. This is what one hears about these Indian fakirs. One discovers that people can possess many mysterious abilities and that one person can have power and strength over others. One begins to seek that power, one wants knowledge. What usually happens to such a person? One stumbles into that very knowledge. I'm not talking about those people who see from the beginning that nothing good will come of this. I'm talking about those people who strive and try to educate themselves, train themselves, practice themselves year after year. The people who succeed in these endeavors reach a point where they try to develop within themselves the ability to see and move astrally. They get out of this physical body. The body sleeps, and they themselves go out. They are aware of the other world and explore things there, and they really get to watch the lives of the deceased from afar. Those people who are moving self-consciously in that other world can get in touch with the Brotherhood, one of whose members comes to them and says, "You're coming into our circle. Do you want to be initiated into that fraternity?" That has been the seeker's wish, and so one bows down and is infinitely grateful. And so one is initiated into the Brotherhood in the astral world while the physical body sleeps. To us, not knowing much, that may be a most marvelous achievement, and yet it is a great stumbling block to one who has striven hard. Even if one does not at first realize it, one may sometimes find that this brotherhood is very far from the secret brotherhood of Christ, far from the secret, holy brotherhood of masters, adepts, great, perfect human beings. One has become a member of a mysterious fraternity whose activities may be very dangerous for humanity. One may discover this someday or one may not. But the one who has gone this way has stumbled and has something else in front of him. Of course, no human being is lost. It is nothing so terrible but the fact that such an aspirant is initiated into a mysterious brotherhood in another world, and that their consciousness is opened in that other world, and that their senses make that other world the object of their study, has the effect that one begins to explore that world with great enthusiasm. One becomes a specialist in the astral world, a specialist and an expert who can tell you a great deal about those things. But the very fact that one is aware of that world and can operate and live in it means that one can create karma for oneself and can tie oneself up in all sorts of things. One will have a lot of work to do in the future, and will have many chains to bear when one wakes up one day and wants to rise to something else. So that is a stumbling block too. But then what happens to someone who thinks of that third side of the initiation mystery, the expansion of consciousness? One doesn't usually think about it so much in the sense that one takes on a greater responsibility. This is usually reflected in one's consciousness in the way that one wants glory and power over other people. One's expansion of consciousness is that one gains power over other people's souls, and as one gains that power, one gains glory. This is a secret quality in that person, so one strives for it, and as one's consciousness expands, it acquires various faculties. Such a person says to themselves, "I aspire to attain magical powers." Such a person may have a tendency to the power of suggestion and may fall into hypnotism, and then on and on into magic. The person becomes a magician. There were many magicians in the Middle Ages, and there still are. A magician has power over people. Some can be helpful, though. Some can heal people and do other good things. But some can also do many bad things. We know about all the wise men, the witches, the sorcerers, and that they could do as much harm as good depending on what mood they were in. If we read the old stories, we find that the seers, who were otherwise good people, had a desire for revenge. They would immediately retaliate if they were not treated politely or recognized. They could not bear not being worshipped. This is a very pervasive trait in people who have clung to that third mystery. I want to say very briefly what the cause of these people's stumbling is and where the right way lies. What is the hallmark of it? What is the right way to the great initiation? The secret cause of stumbling is impurity of motive. It lies in the fact that one has a personal motive in one's endeavor, I want this or that. I want power. I want knowledge. I want to become a member of some fraternity. One does conform to the demands made, but one has a personal motive in one's soul. The aspiration is powerful, but there is a personal influence behind it. This is one's weakness, and this is a very important point for us all to remember. We must examine ourselves. We must be very clearly aware of our own motives if we are to approach the sacred temple of the occult. What about the real aspirant, the person who really starts on the road to initiation? In short, we could say that one is without motive. One certainly has no personal motivation. One is not striving for anything, but one wants to get out of oneself. One wants the truth God. One is not a skeptic or a denier. Such a person will not approach the temple of occultism. One believes and clearly understands that something exists, that God is the only reality behind everything. This one senses but does not know it. One's desire, aspiration and wish is to get away from oneself, to get away from that selfish and personal life which binds and influences the very thing that one does not know or is not able to overcome. One can then work quite freely for all good. Therefore one's motive, if one can speak of such a thing, is that one would like to know the truth, become one with the truth, and know God, become one with God. That is the only true way. I want no progress, I want no power, I want no glory, I want to be initiated into no brotherhood. The only one without whom I cannot be is God. When one can say this to oneself, one is at the beginning of the right way, the way of initiation. How does this true, purely divine motive manifest itself in the soul life of an individual? How does this desire for truth, for God, become visible in one? I think that in most cases, it appears in the way that one knows in oneself what one's life is, what one exists for, and what one should do. One says to oneself, I don't want to set myself any goal. I don't want to define myself in any way or what my life is. I want only to serve life itself, truth, God, and to do only what God tells me to do. I renounce all my own dreams, all pursuit of happiness, all that can be in me. If I have talents, gifts, I will put them at the service of God, of truth. I give myself entirely to truth, if only I knew what life, truth, God are. There is such a feeling in the human soul, and we understand that until this feeling, this will, is in us, we can never be quite sure that we are going in the right direction. For what is normal in human life? What is normal is that we have ideals, dreams, and we have within us ready-made goals to which we want to aspire. This is quite natural, otherwise we would be like animals living from day to day. But we are like Prometheus. Our intellect has the capacity to look into the past and the future. This reasoning is a basic human faculty. Therefore, in one sense, this quality of dreaming and looking ahead comes from one's own blood. And this is all right and good, because it lifts us above the animals. And when we faithfully and conscientiously pursue the end of which we dream, then we fulfill our human duty and attain that end. But now it is a question of initiation, of truth, of God, and of the eternal destination that awaits us all. We will only come to the beginning of that way when we know and feel sure in our hearts that we want nothing but the truth, God. Those names are each according to our own temperament. One loves the word God more, the other the word truth. Those words are quite synonymous. When we say God, we mean it is a living truth, but not the same thing as truth in the scientific sense. When one becomes conscious of this inner desire, one will sooner or later experience this first vision of truth. And let us note, nothing is required except that we should become aware of this. This desire is not new to us. It is an inner desire in us, an inner aspiration in each of us. It is only a question of our finding that desire within ourselves. We are involved in life, and there is much on the surface in us that prevents us from seeing this truth. Even though it is the most natural thing in us, it isn't alien to us. So, when we become aware of this inner desire and aspiration, life will show itself to us. When we want true life so much, when we want to surrender to it so completely, then it does not hide its face from us. Now this discovery of our innermost aspiration perhaps depends somewhat on mysterious circumstances. I do not know what lies behind it, but I may conceive and understand that it lies in the fact that we have either in this or in a previous life heard of Christ or we have not. For the point is, as we have had occasion to observe over the years, that since Jesus Christ lived and worked in the world, a new way has opened up. and since there has always been a way to God, there are now two ways after Jesus Christ. One is the way of the Old Covenant, as the New Testament says in Hebrews, and the other is the way of the New Covenant. When life shows itself to us in response to the most resounding groan of our souls, then this life shows itself to us as a way. Life is no longer something vague. It is not this or that. It is not some great promise of happiness for us, nothing that flatters our personality. But when we see in that first vision, in that awakening, life, then life appears to us as a way. I believe that many people who have now, for example, heard about a way of life spoken of in all religions, when a person sees what life is, they see it as a way with the eyes of their spirit. I remember a theosophist in his youth, at least 30 years ago now, coming to me with joy, telling me that he had reached certainty, that he had really seen what the truth was. His eyes shone with joy and happiness, and he told me that he suddenly saw the great doors of life, the golden doors of life, and the way to them. That door, that gate, opened a little so that he looked through it and saw how far away a wonderful temple shone. And he said that after this he would know what life was and how he should live. In this way many have been able to see the way of life. The way of the Old Covenant, of course, is not only the Jewish religion, although I use the Hebrew name, but the time before Christ in general, for the book of Hebrews says that God used to speak through the mouth of prophets, and prophets were everywhere. So, when one came to the beginning of the old way, one heard and understood that there were very definite steps to be taken before reaching it, and that the way itself had different steps and several initiations. When one reached the end of this preparatory way, one reached the first initiation, and then the second and third initiation awaited one, and so on. Initiation is a word that we have put into practice here in the West. It was not a word used in the old languages, although the Jews had a word that was equivalent to the word initiation. But in the East, for example, they prefer to speak of different ways. Pillars separated the first, second, and third initiations. At these pillars there were ceremonies which proved to the aspirant that one had now passed the first way, whereupon one began to pass the second way and prepare for the ceremony at the end of it. In this manner, the way is still divided into different steps today, and the one who sets out on that way walks in this manner, which is life itself. Either I perform the divine duty which has been given to me as a human being, or I do not. If I want to be powerless and go my own way, I will draw karma upon myself, but if I want to go this way, all is well, and I am going towards salvation, towards liberation. People were usually taught the doctrine of reincarnation. And when one mystically saw the way of life, then it was immediately clear that the teachings about reincarnation were true. What way would have been possible if one had not been a reincarnating being? Only the fact that one came back to walk that way made it possible to reach the goal. In one lifetime, one might have been able to travel only a short distance, but reincarnation guaranteed that one would eventually reach the goal that set one free. A human being is, by nature, bound by their own desires and personality. They have all kinds of mysterious desires. If one starts in a certain direction, all one's desires come to life, and one finds oneself captivated by oneself. The goal of that way is to make one free. One becomes free from one's own personality. That is why that way of life has always been called the way of salvation, the way of liberation. One is freed from compulsory necessity. One can then be born on earth voluntarily. That is another matter, which we shall not go into at this time. This is such a natural thing that I am sure that for very many, perhaps most people, seeing this way of salvation and walking in it is the only thing they can understand in their higher self. This is close to our reason, to our human understanding. It is so clear. There is, of course, nothing wrong with that old way, and it is natural that it also still exists. I will not go into it now, for we can read about it in many theosophical and oriental books. Now I would like to try to describe the other, new way, a little more precisely. This is the way that exists after Jesus Christ, and which should be close to all of us. This other way, which we call the Western or Rosicrucian way, is linked to Jesus Christ and depends on his work, on his joining the life of our earth. Christ, the cosmic Christ, the mystical Christ, that is what we have always talked about, has, of course, always been behind everything. All the great religions, all the saviors, all the great sages who have taught men have been under the influence of the mystical cosmic Christ. But there is another point to be noted. This cosmic mystical Christ was not, so to speak, personified. The cosmic Christ achieved personhood in Jesus Christ. Therefore, the cosmic Christ was once the great inspiration and life force behind all the saviors, but had not yet become personal or fully human in any of them. Only in Jesus Christ did God become man. Before Jesus Christ, the saviors became gods, but not as if God were wholly in them, but as if he was speaking through their mouths. Jesus Christ was the miraculous being in whom God was fully involved, making God personified, in whom the cosmic mystical Christ became a living man here on earth. And then a new way opened up, the way led by Jesus Christ. And one can come to the beginning of that way through the influence of Jesus Christ, seeking him as if from the depths of one's soul or listening to him. I can't really explain this to myself, I don't know the whole story. Therefore, I think that one must have either heard of Jesus Christ in a previous life, or in some way come into contact with him when one comes to the beginning of the way in a subsequent life. Or in the life when one first hears about and is influenced by Jesus Christ, one may already have come to the beginning of that way. But for people who know nothing about Jesus Christ, I believe it is impossible to get to the beginning of that way immediately. For them, the way of the Old Covenant opens up first. But when those seekers are completely sincere, it won't be long before they hear about Jesus Christ through some event in this life, or are born in the next one among people where they have the opportunity to do so. I believe there must be something like this behind it, because otherwise people would not see the way of Christ and understand it. Let that be a mystery, let it remain a mystery. What is both wonderful and true about life is that one can find oneself at the beginning of this new way. And what is one's vision then? What does one then become aware of? What is the nature of one's awakening or rebirth? What does one then perceive and understand? One then realizes the Son of God, Jesus Christ. In other words, one then has the same experience as Paul on the road to Damascus when he saw something and was greatly surprised by it. He saw Jesus, but not just astrally or clairvoyantly as some high being, for he may have seen and heard much about such things before. Indeed, many people had been clairvoyant and had seen such high beings, angels and gods. Why would Paul have worshipped such a thing so fervently? Today we can see angels and gods, and yet we do not worship them. But Paul's life was utterly changed because he saw the mystery of the Son of God and knew what he was. He saw the cosmic Christ, the mystery of the ages, the living God, the perfection of man, who has lived in the consciousness of God since the beginning of the world and since the birth of our solar system. Since that time, the Word, the Logos, Adam Kadmon, the perfect human being, the heavenly human being, for whom and through whom all things were created and all things are, has lived in the consciousness of God, the Father of the solar system. It is because of that plan, that ideal of God, that all things exist. At the same time, Paul saw that Son of God, who is the image of the Father himself, and who is at the same time in every individual and therefore in Paul. He also saw that it had attained a personal manifestation in Jesus of Nazareth. So Paul, seeing the mystery of the Son of God, saw Jesus. It could not have been anyone else. It was Jesus of Nazareth who was God. This was Paul's vision, and anyone can see it when one's soul is pure enough, when one's soul has given up everything, as we described at the beginning, when there are no personal desires and lusts in one's soul. I do not say that one must be perfect, but one must give up conscious desire for anything. One must know Jesus Christ, and one must find in the Gospels wonderful words which fit one's own life. Those words are a necessary consolation to him. But seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things will be given to you as well. Matthew 6:33. That is quite the opposite of what we do in our outward everyday lives, where we are forced to seek everything else. But when one so loves truth and God that one seeks nothing else, then one may almost ask oneself in amazement, what am I, and what shall I become if I seek nothing else but God? And this is all real. One in no way pretends. One may, like Francis of Assisi, renounce everything. One is quite alone, abandoned. One must have no other question than, is there God, is there truth? Let that God show himself to me. Then, when a person sees those words in the Gospel, but seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things will be given to you as well, one pays no attention to that additional phrase. One thinks, Jesus understands me. One takes care of such a poor person. This is one's great consolation. And then there comes a moment when one sees the Son of God, and in that vision Jesus Christ is present. This new way is different from the old. It is not a question of any external obligation to walk the path, grow spiritually, and become more and more free and be saved. This new covenant way is only a question of the Son of God coming alive in me. Naturally, I must follow Jesus, do as he commands, live according to his advice, and always know how he is and how he works. I must strive to fulfill the idea of God's perfection, the Father's ideal, so that I may die to myself, so that the Son of God, Christ, may live in me. Everything is directed towards this, which is at the same time extremely positive, because it is at the same time an activity, a life in everyday life. It is not a life in which one retreats into a forest to study, meditate, or purify oneself, even if such a thing could happen as it did when Jesus was in the wilderness fasting for 40 days. It is because the Son of God through me might live in the world. This is a mystery that cannot really be described in words. You have to think about it, feel it, and know it yourself. But what looms up then is the strange knowledge, the strange promise, which one can of course hear, but which also becomes clear in oneself, that when one has died, not physically but of one's personality, one has completely overcome oneself. One has been set free from oneself, has become a new being, a Christ human has been born in one, and then one will be received into the brotherhood of Christ. One needs no such steps or degrees on the way to make one say, I am now going through such and such an initiation. The great initiation awaits one when one has died to oneself, and nothing prevents one from reaching that goal right now. The wonder of the new way is that there are no time limits or different ways, but there is one great way, and that is dying to oneself. One seeks nothing else, other than that this new being, Christ, may become so alive in one, that one too may be one of the brethren who along with Christ help the world. So, this initiation is available at any time. And such is the remarkable power of an experience like Paul's, his first vision, that Christ lives within him from that moment on, and conquers. One cannot at all imagine that one would fall or be led astray. Why can one not go astray? Because Christ is in one, and Christ in one is so powerful that one goes straight ahead and overcomes oneself, if not in a moment, then gradually. Such a person pays no attention to one's lower self, one steps out of it. One has no such struggles as the person who does not know the Son of God. Therefore all who have seen this Son of God, like Paul, would like others also to see it. Therefore Paul became an apostle, and so did the other followers of Jesus. One who also saw this Son of God and went through a Pauline experience was the first martyr of Christendom, Stephen. He suddenly gave a beautiful and powerful speech, his eyes opened, and he saw heaven. He was stoned to death. Paul was there watching from the sidelines. Paul's own moment had not yet come. We can also speak of initiations in this Christ's way, but then they are just like minor initiations, although they can include the same things that were called major initiations in the old way. In the way of Christ, they are not initiations in the sense that they are some solemn ceremonies by which one is initiated into a brotherhood. There are always dangers in the old way, for one always becomes a member of a brotherhood. They are, after all, different lodges in the invisible world. And there is also the fact that some people always stop at a specific initiation and start working along certain lines and can go astray. Therefore, one may go astray for a moment when, in the invisible world, one finds oneself in brotherhoods with a specific purpose. All these so-called initiations followed by celebrations in the invisible world can be misleading experiences. But when one walks in the way of Christ, one does not take any initiations in this way. One does not want any fellowship with any brotherhood. One does not seek to attain initiations in any way, but one wants only the Son of God, wants only God, and quite self-consciously the Christ whom one sees. One achieves the same things and takes 9 initiations which are called by many names. In fact, the word initiation is not appropriate, because one does not take part in any festivities or make any promises to the brethren. One attains only the knowledge and faculties and expansions of consciousness that belong to the matter. Therefore, in the way of Christ, one can very quickly accomplish them all, because one is not dependent on other people. One's master is up there, and the only initiation one accepts is that of entering the brotherhood of Christ. One who walks the way of Christ is also shown and taught, and one is told of other initiations after the first great initiation. But one cannot first speculate about them, nor can other people teach about them, because they are so impossibly different. To the wayfarer in Christ it becomes clear that we are initiated into the brotherhood of Christ when we have attained all the progress, the perfection that is attainable on this earth. On this earth we humans have achieved the self, Therefore, the task we have been given is to develop this self. It is this personal self that must achieve all the knowledge that is possible to achieve in these conditions. Our self, the inner I consciousness, must therefore learn to know itself, which means that we must become completely independent beings. For let us remember, we would not be able to love if we were not independent. Our love, when we are not independent, is always dependent on something. We are attached to each other by invisible threads. We are very much part of a group soul, but we do not know how to love one another. Love comes of itself for those with whom we have invisible blood ties, but we must be liberated entirely from that. As Christ says, "Anyone who loves their father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. Anyone who loves their son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me." Matthew 10:37. This seems so terribly harsh and strange. How could Jesus have said something so cruel? We must not take it from that point of view, but this: if anything in the bond of blood still affects you, you are not living in Christ. You must be entirely delivered from this. We know that we are today more and more freeing ourselves from the bonds of blood. In the past, people could not marry outside their nation or tribe. Now we are more liberated, and we understand very well that gradually one becomes so completely liberated that one sees no difference between people. One becomes so independent that nothing in oneself prevents one from loving. That is the mystery of Christ. That is the very independence that we can learn on this earth. Every master has achieved such independence. So, we can become master beings on this earth and achieve this independence that makes us Christ beings. When Christ lives in one, when one walks in the way of Christ, one does not expose oneself to the dangers of being tempted to any brotherhood. One wants no other brotherhood than that which is in Christ and which embraces all people. Then one seeks to be a brother of all people. If one makes other unions in this visible world, that is one's business. But I am speaking of the brotherhoods which operate in the invisible world and which seek to attract those people who are following an inner path. Mystical Christ. The mystical Christ differs from the historical Christ because, as we are already taught in our schools, the historical Christ lived in this world and died for us, whereas the mystical Christ lives in us. As Theosophists and Rosicrucians, we think of this mystical Christ above all else. We believe that if the historical Christ, the Saviour, had died no matter how many times for people, and the mystical Christ were not born in our own souls, we would not be saved. Our salvation as human beings lies in Christ being born in us. Therefore, our current presentation of the mystical Christ is intimately related to the above. For if we speak of the mystical Christ, we cannot speak of it except by going into the way in which we are prepared for that mystical Christ's birth in ourselves, and in what way the mystical Christ then lives and develops in us. This then is our subject, and this matter is the same as the way of initiation, which describes spiritual development and has been discussed above. Last time when I spoke of the way of initiation, I was undoubtedly rather obscure and perhaps a little overgeneralized. My presentation may have been incomplete. That is why today I would like to complete that presentation of the way of initiation and to describe it a little more precisely. Of course, depending on the nature of the matter, my description can only be metaphorical. In fact, I really must present this matter metaphorically and not by narration, for if I were to try to describe it in a very dry way, using only some kind of philosophical or scientific terms, the description would not be as accurate and comprehensible as it can be when described metaphorically. But before I begin to describe metaphorically this Christian life in a human being in a very technical, realistic way, I feel like emphasizing what I particularly wanted to show last time. It is a very important point. When people first become theosophists, I think of myself now when I was a young person, we realize that there are, of course, all kinds of societies and fraternities in the world. But when we have a theosophical movement and a theosophical society, as I thought, then we are safe, because this theosophical movement, Madame Blavatsky's great work, has given us a sort of standard of truth, a touchstone by which we can judge all the other societies, movements and endeavors and know where they are wrong and where they are right. We are so merged in spirit with that inner, wonderful vision that we feel we are standing on perfectly serious ground. But then I also thought as a young person, and every theosophist thinks like that, there is an invisible world. And if, in this invisible world, we try to make some progress on our own, striving for knowledge, for victory, for abilities, we will go astray. But if we do not want to seek knowledge and abilities on our own, but rely on the great white brotherhood, of which Madame Blavatsky was an ambassador, then all is well. In the invisible world, there is no other knowledge or real abilities than those who are in contact with the Great White Brotherhood. When we strive along the way that the Great White Brotherhood has revealed to us, we cannot go astray. A person cannot then be drawn into anything other than the Great White Brotherhood. In the invisible world, there are no other brotherhoods but this. The invisible world is such that there can be no other brotherhoods with knowledge and ability. That's how you think when you're young, and you think everything's fine, and you're safe when you get into that invisible world, as long as you're protected by that brotherhood. And how else could you be? It would only be fumbling around if one were to try to develop a little clairvoyance within oneself and try to go out into one's astral world. It's all pointless. In reality, one can't get those abilities unless one is under the protection of the Great White Brotherhood. At least that's what I thought. As a young theosophist, I thought the world was safe with the Great White Brotherhood behind us. But the more you experience life and death, the more you realize how different things are. It's not so safe at all. It's not as if we can just lay our head on the pillow and fall asleep. The invisible world is much richer, much more dangerous than this visible world. It is not that there is only the Great White Brotherhood, because in the invisible world there are many different brotherhoods. We are talking about different levels, and at each level there are different brotherhoods. There are such secret, invisible brotherhoods, which really only work in the invisible world, in the spiritual world. And there in the spiritual world it is just as difficult to know what is true as it is in the visible world. If we do not have a secure foothold in this visible world, then we are like being on the high seas, and we are even more unsafe in the invisible world. We are facing new fraternities and societies. Madame Blavatsky clearly said that there are other kinds of brothers in that invisible world, both black and white. They are very self-conscious in that world and are trying to influence our world too. There are fraternities of this kind which are happy to take in those mystics, those slightly more advanced people who have become conscious in the spiritual world. It is very unsafe in the spiritual world. This is the point I wanted to emphasize last time. This multiplicity of secret brotherhoods then makes spiritual development quite eventful and complex. Therefore, if one wants to avoid all these fraternities and wants to be called a brother of Christ, one must take a straightforward route to the Great White Brotherhood of Christ. We, as occultists and mystics, must take a very direct approach to that White Brotherhood of Christ if we are to avoid the dangers that threaten it. The mystical Christ cannot be clearly described. As theosophists and mystics, we can very quickly think that we have received the mystical Christ and that we are in communion with him. That may be true, but it may also be a mistake. It is very characteristic of people of faith that, in their minds, they can take refuge in their spirit and soul. Believers have created a faith that surrounds their consciousness. They live in that fortress of faith, in their imaginary God, and think, now I can live in peace. God protects my faith from all foreign influences. We find it a remarkable characteristic of all religious people that they are always a little afraid. They say it is the fear of God. They feel that their faith must not be disturbed in any way. It must be protected from all evil. They must not go anywhere in the world. Some are so timid that they cannot look at beautiful paintings or go to the theatre. They would find it too dangerous. They must protect their own faith. This is not just a historical phenomenon. It can still occur today within a sect or religion. While believers may not go to such lengths in modern times, they are still timid and fearful of tainting themselves. When an objective, rational, and thinking person, who is not a believer, but otherwise a good person, looks at a believer, the timidity and cowardice of that believer does not arouse any admiration in one. Woe is me if I were to fall into such a state of mind. I certainly wouldn't want to arrange my soul like that and sit in a tower so that I can do nothing and go into the human world. Such reasoning is not in vain. We may well take note of such criticism. Anyone who is not a believer can see what is lacking in such a believer. It must therefore be specially borne in mind that if our faith, whether theosophical or any other, has the idea that we are in communion with Christ, that the mystical Christ is in us, if that faith makes us in any way impious, unchristian, or makes us think we are better than those other brethren over there, then that faith is not of the mystical Christ, and that communion with Christ is not real at all, it is imagination. For what is the first and only condition if we want to enter into the mystical communion of Christ? The first condition is that we seek Christ, we seek God, we seek the truth. We must first become seekers of the truth. Seeking the truth is our first duty. That is what we would like to awaken in all people. A seeker of truth has been given another name in the world before, and those who know the way of the Old Covenant theoretically can follow my reasoning. The truth seeker has always been called a homeless wanderer. We are not truth seekers unless we are homeless wanderers in our souls, for this homeless wanderer is an individual who is above all free. One cannot be bound in any way. One cannot be bound by wealth, poverty, social status, love and personal relationships, gender, philosophy or worldview. One must be a homeless wanderer who studies everything. One must study all religions and gain as much understanding of life as possible. One must be a seeker after truth in the depths of one's soul. One's intellect must be absolutely free. Any fetters must not bind one. The bondage of materialism is the first to be loosened. Everything that could bind his reason and thought must be cast off. One's faith must not bind him. No matter how dear opinions, prejudices and sins one harbors, one must calmly look at them, find the key to them and the depth of their origin, so that one may be bound by nothing. One must be poor. Foxes have their dens, but the Son of Man has no place to lay his head. In such a state of mind must the seeker of truth live. All existence must be serious and full of meaning. If one has an anchor point, a point in life that attracts one in some respect, then one knows one is chained to something. In that case, one is not a homeless wanderer. Yet one has great peace, for deep down one knows that the truth exists. How else would one investigate everything if one were not sure in one's heart that the truth is also to be found? Such is a seeker after truth and a homeless wanderer. This is what an individual, a theosophist, every mystic and Rosicrucian should be. When one is truly a homeless wanderer, something can happen. I would now like to describe the mystical Christ metaphorically, the life one lives in one's spirit while living here on earth. One does not live that life while asleep, not in another state outside one's body in the invisible world, but in such a way that one remains in clear daytime consciousness when the invisible worlds come to one. When one seeks the truth as a homeless wanderer, one will one day have a miraculous vision, which, of course, is of a supersensory quality, so that another who happens to be beside one would not see it. The homeless wanderer retains clear daytime consciousness. One is in the midst of life and perhaps with other people, but one sees the star of Bethlehem shining in the sky. It is a great shining wondrous star. It is not visible in this external sky. It is somewhere in the sky of one's spirit. One perceives it as if it were outside, for one does not see it in one's head. One does see it somewhere in the sky above. And when one sees that star, one knows that now one has accomplished something. Now one has attained a wonderful and remarkable knowledge. Stop your spirit here, and now build a hut of peace. Now one needs to wander no longer. One has seen the star that shows where home is, where the place of peace is, and there one builds one's tabernacle in the invisible world, in the heavenly world of one's own spirit, there on the plain. That plain is outside Bethlehem. On that plain, on that level, and if I should say still more accurately, on that lower mental plane of the heavenly world, one builds a tabernacle for oneself. In that tabernacle one dwells, there one is comfortable, there is peace and blessing. From there peace and blessing spreads through one to the world. One walks on the plain, and there are others who have built themselves huts, and they are like shepherds. They often listen to the angels singing and playing music. When one has dwelt in that tabernacle of peace, and listened to this transcendent ringing and singing, there comes a moment when the star of Bethlehem shines so brightly that one knows, as the other shepherds on the plain know, that now a child is born in Bethlehem, now the Christ child is born, and we can rejoice. The choirs of angels sing, descend, shine with their presence and fill the air with devotion. And the homeless wanderer, who has built a tent of peace, knows that Christ should be born in the manger. One goes in search of that child. Then one hears something that still draws near. Wise men from the east will come, 3 wondrous kings, wise men, rulers, and the homeless wanderer will follow in their footsteps. One knows in one's spirit that these royal, magnificent wise men of the east, who are rulers, represent 3 different aspects of one's own spirit. The human psyche comprises knowledge, feeling, and will, and in theosophical terms, manas, buddhi, and atma. It is the spiritual side of one's being. And these aspects of one's spirit simultaneously represent 3 different levels. First, the higher mental level, knowledge, manas. Second, the level of brotherly love, buddhi, feeling. And third, the divine level of union, the level of spirit, the level of atma, will. Those sages of the East are as if clothed in the veils of these levels, and they each represent one such aspect of spiritual consciousness. Those wise men lead the way, and the homeless wanderer, who has built a hut of peace, follows behind. Then they come to Bethlehem, to some stable, and there is the Christ child, there is Mary, there is Joseph, and the wise men of the East fall on their knees, and the homeless wanderer stands on the threshold looking at the child whom the kings of the East worship. But most wonderful of all is that one says, or a voice within says, "I am he." But one is not afraid, one must not be afraid, and one lives this life of Christ in one's spirit. Christ is born, Christ grows, Christ lives and works, Christ suffers, Christ goes from Gethsemane to Calvary in one's spirit. All this is beholden by the homeless wanderer, who has built oneself a tent of peace and who says, "I am he." And when one looks around and sees the physical world, sees oneself as a physical being, one knows that all that is happening in one's spirit and in one's consciousness. And what is most wonderful, most profound, and most frightening of all is that one feels oneself there. One is not just saying, "I am it." One can humbly feel that it really is one. One is on the cross and is taken down and lowered into the grave, and it is oneself. It is I. One looks around, there is the physical world, there are people, but one lives in the mystical Christ, and the mystical Christ lives in one. And it's not an illusion, it's not an imagination. One cannot bring forth those visions, those things happen because they will and must happen. And when one has said all this and seen all this, there is a revolution in one's world. It is as if all this had been a wonderful life of the Spirit, and now comes the upheaval, now comes death. For one knows that now one must say, "I am not all that, I am outside it, for I must not exist." One knows that now one is going towards death. But that death is not that we die in gloom, that we die in unhappiness. It is only an illusory death. It is only the death of this physical body. The death that awaits the seeker of truth, the homeless wanderer who has built a hut of peace and who says, "I am it," is not a physical death. What of the physical death that confronts one? The death one now knows is coming, is that one will annihilate one's whole world step by step, degree by degree, member by member. One must die out of oneself, one who lived in one's spirit, the divine life, who in one's spirit was like an angel, a divine spiritual being, a savior, must die of everything, for one must not exist. One must be able to say, "I am not that, I am above self, I am what I am, and I am above self." And when the seeker of truth has come to this, then one dies and descends into the underworld. And now, when one descends into that underworld, a whole new era begins in one's life, a whole new phase, because now one knows that one's mission is to preach to the spirits in the underworld. But this Hades is not only the place where the dead dwell after death, but it is also this human world where souls, beings endowed with self, die, are born again and die again. Both this visible physical world and heaven and the underworld are the places where one who has borne the mystical Christ within one dies. Here one now enters and must help to freedom all those who are captives. That Hades lasts a long time for the one who is both present and not present in the world of people. One is what one is not what one appears to be. And when one has long labored in this outward physical world, the inner world, the heavenly world, and the whole Trinitarian world, living over and over again all that one has lived in one's soul and spirit, there will undoubtedly come a moment called the resurrection. And then the homeless wanderer, who has built oneself a tabernacle of peace, rises from the dead and says, "I am he, and I am not he, for I am above what I am." Then the great initiation will take place, for then one will be received into the white brotherhood of Christ. Risen, one will be recognized as a member and brother of the white brotherhood of Christ, and one will be received by those whom we call masters. Until then, we do not use the word initiation. It is in this way the seeker of truth goes straight to Christ, to the white brotherhood of Christ, and is not satisfied with any initiation into other brotherhoods on other levels. And that is why we say that the great initiation is when the seeker of truth has ascended. Only then begins the great way of initiation, by which one not only attains knowledge, power, and dominion over this earth, but then, by following the way of initiation, conquers other lands and other heavens. These are, of course, mysteries far too great and high for us. And we know if we read, for example, Oriental books about different kinds of ways and different kinds of initiations, or theosophical books that talk about different kinds of initiations, that they all concern life on this earth. They are about the things that one comes to know as one follows the way of the mystical Christ. One does not come to know these things today by being admitted to different orders and ordained in different degrees, but by having acquired the keys of knowledge and power, by walking on the path and appropriating these mysteries oneself. One walks straight toward that kingdom of God where Christ and all the white brethren live. This is all behind the resurrection. I don't know how clearly I have been able to describe these things. They are things you have to think about first, then gradually experience for yourself. Human past. The subject and the way of initiation is so profound, so miraculous, so strangely revealing of the future, that it is almost impossible for us to understand and digest these things unless we create for ourselves as clear an idea as possible of the development of humanity in general, and especially of how the so-called way of initiation has been opened to human beings in the past. We have mentioned that Christianity is right in this respect when it speaks of the Old and New Testaments. The New Covenant is the way of initiation, which has now been opened as a fresh possibility, but the Old Covenant is the way that has been open to humankind up to now and still is, for they still go together, and the Old continues even though the New has begun. This doesn't seem very easy to understand, unless we are aware of humanity's psychological conditions, because it is up to a person to decide which way they will take. We must therefore look at what people have been like during great historical epochs, and what kind of esoteric education they have had, what kind of secret occult schools they have had, what kind of guides and teachers they have had, and what kind of way they have had to follow. We should delve somewhat into the mysteries of the mystery schools of historical periods. I cannot, of course, go into those details which must not be discussed. My presentation will therefore be one-sided and superficial, but to the point, so that we may understand and see how these great teachings have changed over time. Before we can talk about the esotericism of the ages and the occult way of spiritual evolution, we must explore humanity's own evolution. And, of course, we cannot confine ourselves to the information that our natural science, which is only a few centuries old, and anthropology, its parallel science, can provide. They know nothing about humankind's secret development and its prehistoric stages. The various branches of science can draw different conclusions about human beings, but they cannot provide us with information about prehistoric times. However, external science can come close to occult knowledge. But when we want to investigate such matters, we have to rely on the teachings of the Great White Brotherhood and its tradition. Madame Blavatsky made us a little clearer about them. She gave us as much information about humankind and its history as was permissible by her master. In H.P. Blavatsky's magnum opus, The Secret Doctrine, we have received a gift for which we cannot be sufficiently grateful. The reason why this book is so difficult to understand is that it contains an extraordinary amount hidden between the lines. It must therefore be read with a great thirst for truth, with an open mind and an open heart receptive to inner visions. The Secret Doctrine is a guide for anyone who wants to read the Akasha or Akashic records, the memory of nature. I have noticed that those occultists who read from the Akasha, ancient knowledge about the history of humankind in this and other spheres, easily fall into many misconceptions and then into contradictions with each other. And I have been finding that occultists who have trusted their own ability to read the Akashic have forgotten the remarkable fact that the masters had Madame Blavatsky write the Secret Doctrine for the very purpose that when we become clairvoyant and begin to read the Akashic memory, we may have a standard of truth. The Secret Doctrine is not a novel, nor is it a scientific book to be placed in the hands of any scientist. Indeed, scientists may say that it is not worth reading, that it is just rubbish. If, on the other hand, we put it into the hands of an ordinary theosophist, they will read it a little and sweat, but confess that they understand nothing of it. They will read page after page, but will not make any connection. It speaks of Adam, for example, and then suddenly of quite different things. Many theosophists have told me that it is an impossible book, and yet, if the average theosophist doesn't get tired of it, then maybe by the 10th time they start to get a bit of a grip on what it's talking about. But the value of the Secret Doctrine lies first and foremost elsewhere. True theosophists, the truth seekers for whom it was written, are those in whom new faculties begin to awaken, and who themselves begin to see. They are very close to the idea that they themselves can find out about anything. They think that nothing can stand in the way of the human eye. When I sit down to see what it was like during the lunar Manvantara, I only draw before my eyes the picture from there. But unless one uses the secret doctrine as a standard of truth, as a benchmark to see what Madame Blavatsky says about it and how it relates to everything else, one will undoubtedly be deluded. As you all remember, the secret doctrine suggests that humanity on this planet is now living in the fifth root race. There were 4 so-called root races before this one, and in each root race, at least in the later ones, we can distinguish different sub-races, of which Madame Blavatsky says there are 7, and they are divided into nations, tribes and families. Humanity is thus like a great tree, one trunk with many branches and leaves. This 5th root race is called the Aryan or Indo-European race. Aryan is the common name. It is the current European-American people, that is, Western people in general. The 4th was the Atlantean race, which lived on the continent of Atlantis, but had, of course, spread to other parts of the world. The Earth was not formed in such a way that when one continent sank into the depths of the sea, another rose at the same time. Other continents existed at the same time as Atlantis, and there is still something left of Atlantis. Before Atlantis there was Lemuria, which is said to have sunk into the depths of the Pacific Ocean. It was home to the 3rd root race, and some of that continent's islands still exist. Some people of that race lived on continents that did not sink to the bottom of the sea. That is why most of the world's people still belong to the 4th root race. There are also still people of the 3rd root race. There are no more people left from the first 2 root races. This is explained in the secret doctrine. Now, when I want to try to give a general view, both internal and external, of the humanities of these different root races, let us remember that it is a little schematic. Let us remember that if we want to get a detailed, accurate picture of all the periods of evolution of our globe, of all what Madame Blavatsky called the cycles, the other Manvantaras, and the reincarnations of the Earth, then we absolutely must clarify it in detail. We must study the secret doctrine and the Akashic records. But for now, I am just trying to get some idea of the state and evolution of our humanity on this globe. We just want to get a picture of how humanity has roughly evolved, and I think such a picture will be helpful when we want to look at these things in more detail. Our aim is to understand all the mysterious methods of the Old Covenant, and by virtue of that, better understand the methods of the New Covenant. I will present things with this in mind. We do not pay special attention to the timing. And let it be said in passing that if you study modern mystics and their presentations, you will find that there are very great differences in the timing. A French school of thought confines itself to tens of thousands of years when talking about our European, African, and Asian peoples. A German scientist makes these figures even smaller. When he goes to Atlantis, he does not go beyond 7,000 to 8,000 years BC, when, according to his research, Atlantis sank. Plato says that while he was involved in the Egyptian mysteries, the sages showed him tablets of ancient events and told him that there was not much knowledge of them in Greece. These tablets said that 9,000 years earlier Poseidon, a remnant of Atlantis, had sunk into the depths of the sea. Plato lived about 400 years BC, and if we calculate the time according to Egyptian knowledge, we get that Poseidon sank between 11,000 and 12,000 years ago, so the figure given by that German scholar seems to me to be a mistake. That is because he has not remembered the date Plato mentioned. In the secret doctrine, Madame Blavatsky always points out that the best thing is always to add one more zero when scientists talk about these quantities of time. Madame Blavatsky is quite extravagant with time. She counts in hundreds of thousands and millions of years. I cannot say anything about her numbers. I am somewhat of the same opinion as Mrs. Annie Besant, who said at a meeting at which I was present when asked about something which was presented differently in the secret doctrine and in another book, "I do not wish to express any opinion of my own on the subject. I have generally found that if I have had something brought to my notice and have discovered that Madame Blavatsky presents it in another way, I put my own little observation on the shelf and wait. Perhaps she is right, and so it has happened. I have so much respect for Madame Blavatsky and the secret doctrine that I regard that book as the best guide in all occult matters. This is also my position. And I want to say here that I do not interfere with time limits. If one believes one thing and someone else another, so be it. Perhaps one day historical research will shed some light on the matter, and perhaps then Madame Blavatsky's doctrine will prove correct. After all, there are reports today of human bones estimated to be 200,000 years old, and the fact that the human skeleton was much the same then as it is now suggests to me that Madame Blavatsky's figures are quite correct. All who are familiar with theosophical teachings know that our human race is said to have been a kind of animal kingdom, not here on this earth, but in its previous incarnation in the lunar Manvantara, or moon chain. The Bible says there are 7 days of creation, and Madame Blavatsky uses terms such as the first, second, third Manvantaras, and so on. We are now living in the 4th Manvantara. The 3rd was the lunar Manvantara, the 2nd was the solar Manvantara, and the 1st was the Saturn Manvantara. This will be followed by the 5th, 6th, and 7th Manvantaras called Jupiter, Venus, and Vulcan. It is easy for us to remember these names because in our everyday lives there are things, even though we have forgotten them, that remind us of them and bring them to mind. They are the days of the week. Saturday refers to the Saturn Manvantara because in Latin it is dies Saturnus, and in French Samedi, which also comes from the word Saturn, though it has changed phonetically. Then there is Sunday, the day of the sun, in French Dimanche, which means the day of the Lord. The 3rd is Monday, the day of the moon. Then we come to the 4th day, which is central and significant because it is as if nature itself were divided into 2. When, for example, the secret doctrine presents the development of the universe, it does so in the form of 7 spheres, with 3 spheres above, and the 4th below, and then 3 above again. The 4th naturally belongs half to one group and half to the other, and is thus divided into 2 parts. That is why 2 days of the week are devoted to our Earth. Tuesday comprises one half, and Wednesday the other, and they belong to our Earth. Tuesday is Dies Martis in Latin, the day of Mars. Wednesday is Mercury's day, Mercredi in French. Our Earth passes through 2 eras, the Mars period and the Mercury period. Only when the Mars period ends will we have peace, and then intellectual development will begin. Then comes Thursday, the day of Jupiter, Dies Jovi, and Friday, in Latin, Dies Veneris, the day of Venus. The 7th Manvantara remains unnamed because the Earth took 2 of the days. This makes it easy for us to remember the Manvantaras when we start on Saturday, Saturn's day, and remember that Tuesday and Wednesday belong to the Earth. In the days of the week, we have ancient occult knowledge of our own past and future creation cycles. Our human race lived as the animal kingdom in the lunar Manvantara. However, we should not try to imagine what that animal kingdom was like. We will only be misled. It was not like our animal kingdom here, but was in essence an animal kingdom. And it was in that animal kingdom that the birth of humankind took place. It was when the I consciousness was awakened in the animal kingdom. Human development in the animal kingdom was not possible, and they were left to await the rebirth of the sphere in a new Manvantara, the Earth. Here then, we who were in the animal kingdom in the lunar sphere had to be born as humankind. I don't want to go into details, it would be too cumbersome. I just want to give you an overview. We're not getting into timing or rounds, we're just talking about the root races on Earth. We said that during the first root race, humanity had to be incarnated on Earth. In the secret doctrine we read that there are no remnants of that first root race left. Our Earth was not then in the state it is now. There was no hard solid matter or air like today. The Earth was in its infancy. The first human race then lived, as Madame Blavatsky says, in a sacred land. It was that race of the North Pole, and that race had no physical body. It was an astral etheric race. You can see traces of it in the Akasha, but there is no physical bodily trace. This race, which was totally invisible to us, was the first, and we have reason to ask what it was like. If we had become human in the lunar Manvantara, how were we born here? Our birth here on Earth in the first root race was very abstract. Madame Blavatsky called both the first, second, and third races amanas, which means without manas, without reason, without selfhood. Our I consciousness could not descend down to Earth. It was just a drop, and could not possibly awaken in this first root race. Behind our I consciousness is our spirit, our monad, by virtue of which we are divine-born spirit beings. The I consciousness is something that in the course of evolution connects with the spiritual monad. Back in the first root race, that self was so childlike, so innocent, that it could not descend into any form. Monad animates the form. In that first root race, we were given something as a gift. According to the secret doctrine, we received a corporeal form from the Pitris or ancestors. Even today, when we are born as children, we do not create this physical body. We receive it as a gift from our parents, from nature, from life. And if we look at that body, it is very pure and innocent. A Christian church father says that every child is born into the world as God's own, a child of God, and that only later does a person fall into sin. The child is in fact just like an innocent son of God, and this is undoubtedly true. Every time a child is born, Christ is born into the world. But there is not only Christ alone, but something individual that brings karma with it, and the effect of this is that we fall into sin. The Pitris were those who had been humans in the lunar Manvantara and also in the solar Manvantara, the spirits who had achieved human form. We had not attained the form of humans in the lunar Manvantara. How then could we have known how to build the human form for ourselves? This poses the wonderful question of the missing link that scientists talk about. How this development, this evolution has taken place, no scientist can explain. How an animal, which always walks in a horizontal position, was able to stand upright and achieve human form. The further back we go, the more we realize that animals have been great monsters, not nearly as civilized as our animals are now. But even our animals have not risen to walk upright. Our scientists will never be able to explain this fact. That is why Darwin's colleague said it is not possible to find the missing link. Humans could not have been born solely through materialistic processes. Help must have come from elsewhere. He believed in the spiritual world. A scientist has concluded that humans are not just upright animals. Something inside has lifted them. That is why more and more people are being forced to admit that in the secret doctrine Madame Blavatsky has presented things correctly. When we now look at the human specimens born in the lunar Manvantara, who are to be born into this human form, we ask what they could be born into. The Pitris helped to give them a form that enabled them to be born as human beings. The Pitris were so advanced as spirit beings that they could separate an ethereal form from themselves. They didn't have to give birth. And we too will become in future so far advanced that we can do the same as the Pitris. Our monads animated those figures, but our little I-consciousnesses, our human selves, could not incarnate in them because we did not yet have the ability to think. These weak human selves could not assume ethereal human form, but remained outside it. But what does it mean that their human selves had to incarnate here? It means that they had to incarnate into forms that corresponded to the forms they had been in before. When, in nature and in life, a being attains a higher degree, what does it mean in practice? It means that one is then capable of creating a form for oneself and also in a higher degree. One must create for oneself a new form and a new body. This was impossible for the weak human I-consciousness, of course. Therefore they were given the gift of human form and a body in ethereal form. They were what they had been before in the lunar Manvantara. In the secret doctrine it is said that human forms in the first root race were like large plants. Therefore the observer is easily confused when looking at these first forms, for one sees bodies resembling plants or animals, animated or inhabited as if by a human form, with a spirit behind everything. It's easy to make a mistake. Which of these forms is it? For example, when one sees a form resembling a fish, but one also sees the human form, the viewer may think that the human form is the correct form and the animal form represents their spiritual development. But when the adept looks at the human form, they realize that the human form was the inner form and the outer form was the animal form. This is how things were in the first and also in the second root races. These external animal forms became more pronounced, the external forms became more distinct, and the human form became more invisible. Humans appeared more like monsters, the earth became more watery, and they thus became water animals. The early stages of human development. It is not my intention to devote much attention to the history of humanity as a whole, but more specifically to the mysteries of humanity, the history of secret self-education. My intention, therefore, is to talk a little about the conditions that existed in ancient races and cultures for spiritual development. To understand this, we must grasp the past root races in general, and the conditions of inner development, which are always present in a human being both today and in ancient times. Human beings have certainly not always been as they are now. People in ancient times were not as developed as human beings today. Instead, the state of their soul was considerably different. Hence, it is natural that the way of spiritual development was also different from what it is now. As we know from theosophy, we are now living in the fifth Aryan or Indo-European root race. Before that, there were 4 root races. The fourth, the Atlantean root race, which is in the past and of which our profane external history knows little, was closest to us, and before that there was the third root race, which, as we know from theosophical studies, lived on the Lemurian continent. Before that, there were two other races which I tried to describe in some detail earlier, and in this description I stopped to point out the following. Humanity, or rather its spiritual side, the soul of humanity, had animated the animal kingdom in the lunar Manvantara. As we know, we are now living on the fourth day of creation. On the previous day of creation, all of us who now form humanity were there to animate the animal kingdom without any human soul, any human self. We were animals, but on that day of creation our human selves were born. In that lunar Manvantara, a divine ray descended on the animal soul. As mentioned earlier, these human selves that descended into animals could not continue their development in that period of creation. There was not enough time left for us to incarnate as human beings. Therefore, we as eternal souls, I-beings, were born into humanity only on this earth. Here we now animate humanity in human bodies, and our coming here took place, of course, within an appointed period of time. When we look at the first two root races after we moved to this planet, what was life like? It was not the physical world as we know it today. The Earth's physical structure was not as it is now. We lived in an invisible world. We lived in an etheric form that was physically invisible. When we moved here, having previously lived in animal bodies, we could not have created anything but animal bodies ourselves. Therefore, we had to get help from high beings. These angels gave their form, the seed of a human body, as a gift. Just as we now receive a body as a gift from our parents, we receive the future form of a physical body as a gift from higher beings who had previously been human beings. The consequence of this was that in the first and second root races, we had a human form as a seed, but the physical or etheric body which we had by virtue of our own karma, by virtue of the powers which we ourselves brought with us from previous evolution, was animal in form. We had been animals and had no capacity to create anything but animal forms. Therefore, our own human body was very peculiar in appearance, but within it one could see the form of that human figure. The result of this was that our reason, our thinking self, which was a very weak fire and only just born, could not dwell in that physical body. Those beings were senseless and animal-shaped, and only inside could you see the human figure as a seed. In the beginning there were also plant forms, but then later there were also animal forms. These are things to keep in mind, though they may be a little difficult to understand. We must study the secret doctrine to get a clearer idea of this. Let us therefore bear in mind the critical fact that humans themselves could not create anything other than what they had left of the animal body, and we all understand this. We had the body of an animal, but a human form within it. Then we move into the third root race, when our external human history really begins, because by the time of Lemuria, the Earth had developed a physical constitution. There are still traces of Lemuria on other continents. In that Lemurian period, we were initially physically invisible beings, and that is where this human figure began to appear more and more clearly. And when we look at this third root race and its people, we see giant beings who are human in their inner nature. They have a human form, but their physical appearance is often animal, however, that human form is already clearly visible. The third root race giant has a human body structure, but its face is that of a bird, for example. Behind the bird's head you can see a human head. This is the etheric form we received as a gift. The external head of the giant of the third root race was, for example, a bird's head, and the body was not as human and beautiful as our visible body is now. It was very animalistic, very ape-like, and very rough. The giants of the third root race were often outwardly lion-like, eagle-like, very seldom human-like. During the third root race, as you can read in the theosophical books, excellent beings, adepts and masters came to our earth from Venus, led by exalted beings, and established here the great white brotherhood which has been here ever since. These high beings came to help human beings, otherwise we would have remained without reason for a very long time and would have evolved very slowly. We would not have been able to develop reason and human faculties because our mind was still such a weak fire within us. It would probably not have been able to develop for thousands and millions of years if it had not been for the helpers, the evolved people who came here to our planet to take us forward. A human child would not become human if left to its own devices. One would not have the intelligence, the faculty of thought, the refined emotions that a human being can have. Therefore, nature does not leave anything to develop on its own. In the early stages, teachers must guide it. As we organize schools for our children, so in the same way, the brethren of the Great White Brotherhood came to guide us by their words and example. That's how we gradually evolved into human beings, with the human character beginning to appear in us, and are starting to speak in a human language. It was very vowel-rich at first, but it gradually developed into something more varied under the guidance of the great teachers who incarnated among us and taught us. Those people built cities under their teachers' guidance, learned to cultivate the land, and then gradually developed some arts and sciences. Of course, it was all imitation at first, following an example. Alongside this emerged a fact we must not forget. We split into two sexes and acquired physical, flesh and bone bodies. I don't mean they were like the bodies we have today. They were roughly made at first. People were given leather clothes, as the secret doctrine says. People were divided into two sexes, and this had its own tragedy. All this was connected with the Great White Brotherhood's arrival on Earth. Its members were absolute divine beings for humanity. We looked upon them as children look upon their parents and teachers. We regarded them as divine beings. It is difficult for a child, if one is not a philosopher, to understand God absolutely, but one understands him when one thinks of one's parents and teachers. It was the same in the third root race. People understood that the Great White Brotherhood had to be obeyed because these beings were also extremely beautiful and magnificent, quite different from us. They were outwardly like we were in our etheric form. Our physical bodies were very clumsy and animal-like, even though we walked upright on two legs. We worshipped these divine beings, kneeling before them and obeying them blindly, for our intellect was still very small. It is also worth noting that before we split into two sexes, we knew nothing about death. When death came to the physical body, when it had passed away, we ourselves had created a new body into which we then passed. We didn't notice any difference at all, but moved easily from one body to another. But when we split into two sexes, then came death, and psychologically speaking, the Atlantean period in our lives began. And that means that our senses, especially our sight, which had been active in the astral world, began to become physical. At the same time, that sight became physical, the inner eye became blurred. It didn't blur completely, we were always clairvoyant, but we couldn't clearly see the gods that were in etheric form. When our eyes were open to the physical world in Atlantean times, day became like night. For when we slept, our eyes opened to the world of the gods, and when morning came, our consciousness grew dim, and we felt that we were in another world. At first, physical sight was dim, and therefore it was very difficult to live. During the Atlantean root race, the physical plane, this physical world, only gradually became clear to us. Its outer aspects became increasingly visible. We know that sight that can perceive the clear outlines of objects and create fine art did not just fall from the sky. The eye we have is the result of millions of years of evolution. Our vision was initially very weak in relation to the physical world. It was so dim that when we perceived something in Lemuria and Atlantis, it was at first physically invisible. Yet a perceptual phenomenon occurred in the imagination. We might have a visual impression, but it reached the soul as a sense of hearing or taste. Let us imagine that we had come close to a lump of sugar. As we approached it, some illumination would have come into our imagination and a sweet sensation would have entered our mouth, but we would not have seen the sugar lump itself. It was millions of years before we saw that piece of sugar. We could have felt it, put it in our mouths and tasted that it was sweet. It was an astral sensation that affected this along with the physical. Next we moved from the Atlantean root race to the fifth root race. Let us remember, however, that root races overlap one another. So, it is not the case that when one root race ends, another begins. In part, they exist simultaneously. We are now living in the fifth subrace. Before that, there were ancient Indian culture, Egyptian culture, Babylonian Syrian culture, and Greco-Roman culture. Now there is the fifth subrace of European culture, or whatever we want to call it. During the fifth root race, our physical bodies have looked like they are today. There is no longer any distinction between the etheric form and the physical body that there used to be. When we look at our present humanity, we find that the physical and the etheric bodies are one, for the etheric form which we received as a gift has become our own body. It is now one with the physical body existing a few centimeters outside it. In this fifth root race, we can see that the old clairvoyance, which still prevailed in Atlantis, has gradually disappeared, and humankind has increasingly entered the physical world and conquered it. We are much more attached to the physical world than in the old Indian culture, but we are no longer as attached as the Greco-Roman culture was. As we have already seen, evolution takes place in 7 cycles, 7 cultures, and 7 sub-races. In a certain sense, the fourth sub-race is at the lowest level, and then the ascent begins. That's why Madame Blavatsky says in her secret doctrine that we were much coarser in the fourth root race than we are now. In Atlantis, our brains were also much coarser than they are now, and since then our brains have softened, which of course sounds a little odd to scientists. Of course, it's a figurative expression. At any rate, we were deeper in matter when judged from the inner perspective. Our understanding of the outside world is becoming increasingly apparent in this fifth root race, and we have learned to see it more clearly. Imagination no longer influences us when we look at the world around us. If there are, say, 7 of us walking down the same street, we all see in the same way. There are, however, very small differences in our perceptions. There would be no reality had it not been for the common reality that has now been formed in this fifth root race. It is based on individual perception and is equally true everywhere. The same reality existed in Atlantis, but we saw it in different ways depending on our imagination. Reason has become the same for everyone after a long, long effort. Now that we have an overview of humankind's past, we can move on to our real subject, the way of initiation. We humans here on Earth are rational beings, and therefore we have questions that do not arise in animals, which do not think and reason in the same way as we do. When those great beings came here and founded the Great White Brotherhood and the secret school of our humanity, we can understand that their mission was to show us what life is, to educate us in the knowledge and art of life, to awaken in us that desire to go forward and educate ourselves. That is why there has always existed a so-called occult, esoteric, secret self-education. It has existed since the dawn of time, as long as the Great White Brotherhood has existed on Earth. When we were in Lemuria, we could not yet speak of such self-education, for we human beings were still too undeveloped for it. We could only imitate. The work of the sages was only to set an example and to teach in an outward sense. But in Atlantis, we can see how those great teachers were clearly given a new task. What is this secret way of initiation? Its purpose is to perfect human beings, to bring us to the goal set for our earthly life. So, our life, our Earth, teaches us the perfect art of living. There are clearly 2 sides to such education and self-education. One is that we need to know whether there is any real purpose to our existence. This question, after all, often takes the following form: is there any other purpose to our life than that we exist only as such beings for a moment on Earth, or do we exist even after death? For we cannot have any common goal of attaining higher knowledge if we live only for a moment, die, and then cease to exist. There is the question of whether we exist after death. This question is clearly placed before us. Moreover, there is another question. What is our purpose? What is the purpose of existence? If we exist even longer than this physical life lasts, what is its purpose? We have already said that it is human perfection. So, we have to answer these 2 questions. Is our life and existence longer than physical life? Do we exist after death? And if we do, what is its purpose? If we look back at the Lemurian period, we find that we did not know how to ask this question then. In the early days we had no death, and then our lives were so ordered that we had to imitate the gods. Even a child does not philosophize about why they exist. One is content to exist and do what one's father, mother, and teachers want one to do. It was the same in Lemurian times. We did not need any esoteric education. But then, when that split into 2 sexes occurred, death also occurred. And then arose the question of what this existence is. And the question came to mind, perhaps vaguely, why am I now in this world? And when one felt that one was with the gods at night and during the day, one remembered all the beautiful, wonderful, and wondrous things one had experienced. One wondered why one had to be in such a strange, dim, and misty world, rather than in the world of the gods. The atmosphere at that time was very full of water and gas. In Atlantis, it was vital that one should undertake some inner work. When we now talk of inner self-education, we are talking of higher things. Everyone is now doing internal work. It is now the law that everyone must go to school. It's self-education. No child is left to be idle, but must exercise and cultivate their reason and work hard. It means that we are now taught to be industrious. We must be human and educate ourselves. We must no longer be idle and work lazily. We must learn to think. That is how humanity has gone a little further. Everyone in Atlantis also had to start educating themselves. They would not have become human if they had not begun working for themselves. We had to make our own physical bodies, for we were animal-like. Even though we were modeled on the bodies of higher beings, our physical bodies were animal-like only in the head. So, it was a question of how to become human. We also had to become human in appearance because the mind could not work freely when the brain was animal. Therefore, we had to have a human appearance. This was only possible because teachers and leaders gathered some students around them and helped them think and contemplate the human form. Our physical composition was softer than it is now, so it was easier to mold ourselves physically. That was our job. And it was only possible because the teachers inspired us to look at the human form, often their own form. And what was the result of this? The pupil had to fall so in love with the teacher that the teacher's form became dear to them, and then they could shape their own body a little. Of course, the teacher did not want to show their own form except as a subject for contemplation. In reality, they showed the form of Christ. They gave them the head of Christ as a mental image, but, of course, the pupil confused that image and saw in it the features of his teacher, so that the head of Christ came to resemble their teacher more and more. This is a marvelous love affair of which we can see echoes in the old mysteries and goddess tales. If you know my book, The Key to the Kalevala, it explains that the Lemminkainen story concerns old Atlantean matters. Lemminkainen was a god, and we should not think he had ordinary love affairs. That was the only way in the Atlantean era. A higher evolved being had to awaken love, admiration, and infatuation for themselves in those childlike people, those young, unevolved humans, for they were attached in Atlantis as a mass soul. They could not separate themselves from the mass soul into personal beings except by being torn away from it, and that was achieved by falling in love with someone who was not part of that mass soul. They then inwardly separated themselves from the mass soul and became like that beloved being. During the esoteric meetings, a perfect human being was presented for meditation, and when we meditated, we noticed our appearance changed. It was so noticeable that when we looked at each other, we saw we were gradually changing. The more sharply we could think, meditate, and obey our teacher's advice, the faster we changed. Of course, it took hundreds of years. But our lives were long, and with the most tremendous effort, we were able to mold ourselves into a body and face that resembled a human being. We did not yet have any beautiful Apollo faces, but the animal form disappeared. This was a very occult event in which we humans were able to create a human form for themselves. That was our mission in Atlantis. Most of humanity has accomplished that, and now all humans are human in this fifth root race. So, in Atlantis, esoteric self-education involved us becoming human in appearance. And only then could we begin to develop in ourselves human senses, human reason, and other human faculties. Past and present. For a person who has begun to think and become a seeker of truth, the central and important question is whether one still exists after death, or whether life ends with the end of this visible existence. The mysteries of initiation explore this very question. And having become convinced that life continues after death, another question arises. What is the purpose of existence? There is a difference between people in general and those seeking initiation. Ordinary people can make up their own minds about these things. They can become convinced, by study, by observation, that humans exist after death. All religions have spoken of it, and people have believed it. But when we enter upon the way of initiation, then we understand that these things must be matters of knowledge. Then no well-founded conviction will do. Then one must acquire knowledge. And that knowledge must not be external, not knowledge, for example, based on the idea that the spiritual world is connected with this visible world, but based on first-hand experience and knowledge. Only such knowledge has any significance for the initiation process. And another thing we can also be convinced of is the meaning of life. With that we can create very real images for ourselves. But this too must be based on a real vision, a real knowledge, a real hearing, and a very clear experience when it comes to knowledge of initiation. However, these two things are of such a quality that we can form correct ideas and beliefs even though we are quite ordinary people. It is, for example, a correct belief that human life does not end in death but continues, and that humans are reincarnating beings. It is also true that the purpose of life is the attainment of human perfection, or in other words, that we must become like Christ, that the cosmic consciousness must take up its abode in us, that Christ lives in us. Thus we may have true ideas about the continuity and purpose of life, but we cannot be initiated if we do not know these things. These things are based on the third point, which enables us to achieve conscious immortality and work continuously for progress. This third point is our immortal body. For what would the continuity of life mean if we could not continue it one day in a body in which we are conscious and which allows us to live through the ages? If we only live in this world, die, and are born again, then we are personalities who remember nothing of the past. Then our work will always involve a certain amount of groping in the darkness no matter how much enlightenment we receive. But only then does the continuity of life become real, when we have such a body that lives through the ages and in which we are consciously immortal spirits, whether in life or in death. So, the third question is, how is that immortal body to be created? We can conceive of it for ourselves even if we are not yet in that body. And all modern public occult teaching is aimed at getting us to have the idea of these three questions. From this, we can get the right idea that the body which we are gradually organizing from one life to another, creating for ourselves, is not a physical body, like this visible body of ours, but it is a body formed of fine particles of matter, and we have it already at this moment, for it is what we call the etheric body. It is our once future, eternal, immortal body. The formation of this etheric body is therefore the be-all and end-all of all occultism. It is the most occult thing of all. From this we understand that there must always be some practice. It is not enough to have beautiful thoughts, such as the belief that we exist after death, or to think beautifully about the meaning of life. That is true in thought and feeling, but the question of the instrument itself, the body, is not a speculative epistemological question, it is an occult, practical question. Therefore, all practical occultism is connected with the creation of the etheric body. So when we look at the past, the history of humankind, through the eyes of occultism, and examine the different aspects of human beings, especially their physical etheric body, we make many very interesting observations, of which we have already spoken a little about. I will briefly repeat these things because they are so important that we must have them clear in our minds to understand initiation and its preparation. We humans were gifted the seed of the etheric body by the angels, the moon Pitris, here on earth, and then we had to create a physical body for ourselves to form a kind of shell around that etheric body. And in that respect, we could do no more at the beginning than what we had been doing in the lunar Manvantara, namely creating animal bodies. In the first root race we were plant-like, in the second animal-like, and in the third human-like, in the sense that our etheric body began to be gigantic and our physical body was more or less animal-shaped with the head of an ape. Then there was the fall, which means that we were clothed in leather with a physical body that was much softer than the present one and also giant-sized. It was by no means beautiful but somewhat animal-like. At the end of the third root race, the forms were similar to those of the beginning except that the physical body was more solid. When we then look at the development of the people in Lemuria, after the fall and after help had come from Venus and Mercury, and after the Great White Brotherhood and its spiritual leadership had been established on this planet, we humans, who were in the position of a child, then learned to imitate, admire, respect, and serve these higher beings. The secret doctrine states that the original religion, the wisdom religion, theosophy, was then established. People had only one wisdom religion then. It was a very poetic time, like a paradise. We knew nothing but to imitate, to look up and worship those divine beings. They taught us how to build cities, cultivate the land, and do all kinds of work. And the remarkable point that is particularly worth remembering is that our consciousness, our reason, which was gradually awakening in us, and for which we had no purpose in those first root races, was very much awakened by the many kinds of physical suffering inflicted on us by those great teachers. We didn't yet know anything. We had no sensations or feelings. Our sense of self was really on another level. You couldn't see your own body. You didn't really know you had one. One lived only in the imagination. And when one perceived an object, saw some kind of aura, one didn't see it physically. In fact, in ancient Greek mythology we are told how the giants were one-eyed or blind, which is why they could not see well. This is an accurate description, as the Lemurians and Atlanteans could not see with their physical eyes. There is also a curious passage about this in the Old Testament. At school I remember wondering, and other boys wondered too, what was meant by the saying that Adam knew Eve and then to them was born. It was strange to us, and no one understood it. It was later explained to us that it was subtly conveying ideas that could have been expressed differently. But the holy books do not embellish things, they say things directly. After humans divided into two sexes, they were by no means conscious of their own bodies. They only became conscious of it when they were united with the second sex, which was at first quite instinctive and subject to astrological influences, and it could only happen at a time when another being was to be born. People knew nothing of lust. At the time when this union took place, they became conscious of each other only for a moment. It was a rather wonderful spiritual thing, at most an experience with a beautiful color phenomenon, but it did not at first have any of the pleasure that it later developed into. Another thing to note about the Lemurians, they had no memory. This is actually quite remarkable. as if we were to wake up in the morning and remember nothing. We were living as if we had a new life. It was only when the people of Lemuria were taught a certain lesson, when these great divine teachers put people in the same situations over and over again, that their memory was awakened. When the experience was renewed again and again, then one began to think, but I have been through this before. This teaching was done precisely through pain. The painful experience was renewed again and again. For example, children were taken into the forest and left alone for long periods so that they could experience the harsh weather, storms and other frightening things on their own. When the same experience was repeated, they might feel that they had experienced the same thing before as we do. That is why we have atavistic fear in our blood. Many people as children have an innate fear of darkness and ghosts. It is in our blood from Lemurian times, when we had to get used to the harshness of nature. And what storms they were! Today's fierce winds, even in southern Europe, are nothing compared to what they were in Lemuria. There we also experienced the proximity of wild beasts. We had hearing and touch, we could hear their sounds, so there is a kind of atavistic fear in our blood. In Atlantis our memory developed in a very special way. We lived as if in a shared memory. People who belonged to the same family lived as if in each other's memory, knowing what the others had experienced. In Atlantean times our memory reached a peak we do not have now. It was not really memory in the modern sense, but an awareness of what members of the same family had experienced over many generations. In a way, it was remembering, but not individual remembering, because personal remembering has only developed in this fifth root race. The Atlanteans were unconsciously influenced by each other to a great degree, so that when they wanted to evolve humans, they did it telepathically. They tried to make the human body, especially the face, look like a human being. And we should not think that we were self-conscious thinkers. No, we were believers who received the influence telepathically. When the teacher showed us the mystical Christ, the perfect human form, and said to us, "This is how you must imagine your own body," that was, of course, telepathic influence. And we could not keep the teacher's image of perfection clear in our minds because their own image was mixed up with it. That's why we humans look different. We had different-looking teachers. In addition, each individual was influenced by their own appearance. In the previous chapter, we came to the fifth root race in our review. Now we should take a closer look at the mysteries of its various sub-races. If we consider the early times of Lemuria and Atlantis, we may see that the occult method of that time was to develop the physical appearance into the human by means of the etheric body. The etheric body was to be merged with the physical body, as is the case now. The etheric body extends as a mist a little beyond the physical body. At the same time as we became human in appearance, this fusion of the etheric body and the physical body had taken place. When it comes to death, immortality and life in another world, there is always the question of sleep. It has been said that sleep is the younger brother of death. Even today, when people talk about life after death, they often draw on the similarities between dream life and death. And when a person begins taking the first steps on the path to initiation, they become aware of their dream life. Dreams become more dramatic. Indeed, the question of death is also a question of dreams, for to dream is to leave one's physical body. As a conscious being, sleep has always been a change of state in which consciousness, which during the day has been in this physical body, moves elsewhere at night. When we look at the Lemurians, we see that their dream life was much more real than their day-to-day life. They seemed to live a real life at night. They were clearly with the gods, living a heavenly ideal life. In the daytime, on the other hand, when their consciousness was fixed in the physical body, everything was very dim. There was a veil over that other world as well as this world. In Atlantis, this dream life was still somewhat similar to that of Lemuria, but that waking life gradually began to become clearer, more conscious. Nevertheless, the dream life was a transition to a happier state, to another world where there were gods, high beings. There, one felt at home. When we come to the fifth, Aryan root race, this relationship has changed again somewhat. Now the aim is for one's consciousness to conquer this visible physical world, making it fully real. For this purpose, it has been necessary that the spiritual world should increasingly lose its power of reality. Therefore, when we compare the Indian, Chaldean, Jewish, Iranian and Celtic subraces with our own fifth subrace, the Teutonic, we see how our consciousness becomes increasingly immersed in matter and how this world becomes more and more real. At least this happened up to the fourth subrace. Now, in the fifth subrace, we are already rising a little above it. This descent into matter took place so that this visible world too had to be absorbed into the real. The fact is that we cannot create for ourselves any immortal etheric body unless we have complete mastery of it. We were given the seed as a gift, and theoretically we could have had the possibility of remaining immortal beings in paradise. Indeed, some religions suggest that we initially lived in paradise and could have continued to live there in eternal joy and bliss. But it was essential that we did not remain living in paradise. It is not a blessing but hinders development and takes one backwards, because it stifles one's individual enterprise. It is good that a person is helpless here on earth at first, so they learn to use their own reason to get by. The same is true, occultly speaking, of the whole life of humankind. We were given the seed of the etheric body as a gift, and we could have stayed in that state and not fallen into two sexes and sexual procreation. But then we wouldn't really have been anything. The point is then that one must become master of one's etheric body, discover its secrets and create a new etheric body for oneself by preserving that seed. That would not have been possible in a plastic etheric body. One had to put on a rigid, hard, rough physical body because it made one's thoughts come alive. If we had stayed in the paradise state, imagination would have taken over, and what is the value of imagination that is not grounded in reality? Imagination had to become thought, reason. And that is only possible in a body that does not allow the imagination to fly, where one can put the imagination in check and see how things really are. Our imagination can show us one thing and another, but if we are thinking people, we don't take it to the full until we get our heads around things. This has been made possible by our physical bodies, the garments of skin, the fall, and the fact that death came into our midst. At the beginning of the third root race, we knew nothing about death, but when death entered the world, our life and our whole being gradually became what they are today. Everything in life now has its own way of making us think. We see only superficially because the ancient clairvoyance is gone, but now we have the opportunity to create a new etheric body for ourselves. This etheric body must not be such that it suddenly swells to gigantic proportions and then suddenly disappears almost into nothingness like some natural spirits. Such a body would not be fit for a serious being. Of course, if one wishes, one can reduce or enlarge oneself, but it must not go unchecked. A serious being, an angel and a god, must exist in a dignified way, and for that, we as human beings must create an etheric body for ourselves. When we look at the Lemurians, we find that when they slept, their consciousness withdrew from the physical body and entered the etheric body, and because their consciousness was astral, they were conscious of those things. And if a person then received an esoteric education, it meant that their consciousness immediately rose to their own true self, and with it they could look at the world which is now very difficult for us to reach. That was quite natural in Lemuria for those who did esoteric work, but they were few and far between. If we then look at the people of Atlantis, we find that their consciousness at night left the physical body, was clothed in an etheric body, and moved freely in the astral mental world. Then, here in the fifth root race, we find that the etheric body has become more and more attached to the physical body, so that it does not move out of the physical body at all. Only in death or stupor does part of the etheric body go out. The physical and the etheric bodies are now so attached to each other that when one sleeps, one does not take the etheric body with one at all. Consciousness, more or less awakened, passes into the astral body, which is not an organized body but resembles an aura. Such is the situation now in this fifth root race. So, in Lemuria, the etheric body was quite free. In Atlantis, it also went out of the physical body, and if one in Atlantis received occult instruction, its effect was to raise the etheric body out of the physical body easily. But in this fifth root race, the etheric body is so grown into the physical that one cannot get out of the physical body self-consciously, but goes into the astral body semi-conscious when one falls asleep. This is why human dreams are confused. That is why only the aspirant who begins spiritual practice dreams more lucidly, and this is caused by the fact that they take a little ether with them into the astral body, but not all of it. When we look at the various sub-races of this fifth root race and their cultures, we find that it is this relationship between the physical and the etheric body that mystery education must have taken into account. When in ancient India, in the culture of the first sub-race, one became an esotericist, an occult aspirant who wanted to move towards initiation, one had experiences following the advice given him by their teacher. Their dream life became very real, much more real than it becomes now, so real that they made the observation, the life I live in my sleep is real life, and this physical life is Maya, an illusion. That's why in India it was easy to argue philosophically that this life is an illusion and that we have to look for one great reality, Brahma, the absolute reality. The Indian beliefs of the time helped them to understand that real life was on the other side. And we know how echoes of this have survived in all religions. The religion of the first sub-race of the fifth root race always emphasized the fact that this visible life is an illusion and that real life is in the spiritual world with God. There is a profound occult truth in this. It still sounds very poetic to everyone and resonates with them. It does not seem impossible, even though in this fifth sub-race one has begun to think more and more about what it means that life in another world is more real. That is, of course, a correct observation nowadays, although that other thought is also correct in a way. In Indian culture, the esotericist who was deeply immersed in the dream life, being there on another plane, learned from their teacher how to draw in more and more ether from their own physical body to become fully conscious. At first, they remembered as if they were having wonderful dreams in another state of being. They were not self-conscious, but they felt vaguely, oh, how miserable life is here on earth. In that other life there is bliss. But then they learned to drag the ether more and more with them and became aware in the astral world. All their occult development took place in the invisible world. When we come to the second subrace, the Chaldeans, Assyrian, Babylonians, Egyptians and Jews, we see how one has become more and more grounded in matter and how the visible world begins to become ever more real. When the esotericists in these cultures followed the occult method and made observations in the other world, they found that life there was altogether empty, that the life of the dead was altogether unproductive and dreary. This depended on the fact that the esotericist in Egyptian culture could make the precise observation, the most important life of all is this visible life. If the Indian clearly understood that visible life was only an illusion, a reflection of the spiritual life, the Egyptian realized that the spirit life was only a bad reflection of the visible life. So, since visible life was the only real life, something had to be done about it. Reason evolved. The old Chaldean esotericist looked at the sky, the sun and the stars, hence astrology, and realized how much the stars influence our lives. Science was born. The Egyptians began to pursue knowledge in a whole new sense. The ancient Indians had indeed spoken of knowledge, vidya, Veda, but it was knowledge of a higher god. Only the Egyptians, the Jews and the Chaldeans, the people of the second subrace, began to understand the knowledge of things that belonged to the visible world, things that could be perceived by the senses. This is still the case in this fifth subrace. This scientific observation began in the second subrace and came into the world through the esotericists, who developed themselves according to the advice of their teachers. When we then study the third subrace, the ancient Persians and Iranians, we find that their experience was not quite the same as that of the Indians and Egyptians. Their experience was not that their dream life was blissful, but that there were two forces in the world, good and evil. While they slept, they were fighting for good against darkness. And as they learned more as esotericists and received more accurate advice, like the Indians, they learned to draw into themselves the ether from the physical body and became aware of that astral world where there is good and evil, light and darkness. There they saw terrible, cruel spirits of nature and elves. They also saw the dead and experienced all that is in the astral world. They then brought into the physical world clear knowledge that there are two forces at war, including in this visible world, which is like a reflection of the invisible. That is why, in the old Iranian religion, they speak of Ormuzd and Ahriman. They said, we have to serve Ormuzd in this visible world, to work in this world, because all evil is also here. Reflected in this world in the form of thunderstorms, excessive frosts, heat, and all kinds of suffering. And we know how the later religions of this fifth root race always echo this great doctrine. There is good and evil constantly at war. It is found in the Jewish religion and in the Christian doctrine as taught by the Church. We Finns need only think of the Kalevala to see this same struggle between good and evil. This has all been due to the experiences of the aspirants who, during that culture, made observations in the invisible world. Egyptian initiation. We have seen how much work the human spirit has had to do, how we have had to experience and work hard before reaching the level of development we are at now. These are interesting but complicated things. We would like to ensure that everything is easily understood, and we are reminded of that old phrase, the truth is always simple. And so it is. But if we look at nature and life, we find that the manifestation of truth and life itself is not so simple. It can be very difficult to understand the laws of life. We have seen how human consciousness has gradually evolved precisely in such a way that it has become increasingly grounded in matter. And since there is a law in life that what has been experienced before is always repeated in a short form later on, we get a good picture from a conscious point of view if we look at the phenomena of consciousness with which we are now familiar. If we look at the fact that we are awake during the day and asleep at night, and look at the different states of consciousness we have at night, we shall find that these different states have been acquired gradually. Now we have that state of consciousness which we call daytime consciousness, and when we go to rest at night, our consciousness enters a sleep state, which is either dream vision or dreamless sleep. And scientists assure us that when our consciousness approaches daytime, it is a dream vision which can be very confused. But the further our consciousness leaves this daytime, the more dreamless sleep becomes, and it is then also the most refreshing dream of all. The state closest to daydreaming is confused sleep, followed by logical sleep, and then dreamless sleep, which is heavenly and refreshing. These different states have been achieved over a very long period of evolution. I will now say no more about the first and second root races. Then, as human beings, we were not involved, although our spirit did have an effect. When we look at the third root race, we see that our state in the first half of Lemuria before the fall was a dreamless sleep during the day. And why was it sleepless? Because our own sense of self was quite childish and weak, like a flickering flame. Yet the dream was about seeing and realizing we realized high gods, high beings. That is why in all religions it is said that in the beginning humankind lived in a paradisiacal state, meaning that our consciousness was in heaven, and it is still there today if we can enter into dreamless sleep, which is rare. But at night, instead of sleeping in Lemuria, we withdrew our consciousness from the physical body, and then we entered a higher state of consciousness, which we can call ecstasy. But it was very dim and vague. Then, when the fall happened and we humans got physical bodies, our state of consciousness changed again. It descended more and more into matter, and we got into a state in our daytime that we now call sleep. Only when we were asleep did we enter heaven to engage in communion with divine beings. This period lasted from the middle of Lemuria to the middle of Atlantis, by which time our eyes were so advanced that we began to see physically. When we dreamed during the day, it meant that we did see this physical world, but in the form of dream images. It was only towards the end of Atlantis that we began to see this world more and more clearly. This has continued until this fifth root race. In this fifth root race, up to the fourth subrace, we entered deeper and deeper into matter. Now we are in the fifth subrace, the Teutonic, and the visible world has become increasingly clear to us. At night, we are now entering the state we had during the day in the previous evolutionary period. When we now turn our attention to so-called esoteric, occult development, to walking the path of initiation, we find, as we have pointed out before, that this is peculiarly connected with the etheric body. That is what we have tried to explain. I will say a few more words about this. What is at stake when we talk about occult self-education? It is a question of accelerating development, of developing faster than life in its everyday form would allow us. The path of initiation is there so that we ourselves may help nature, so that we do not leave everything to nature as animals do. We human beings are creatures who can help nature and life because we have reason and feeling. We can become God's collaborators, his co-workers. This is a common feature of the world, and it is more or less the case that when there is a need to speed up development, helpers come from elsewhere. Our whole society is organized so that we try to develop ourselves by providing schools and other educational opportunities. We are no longer living the life of a savage. Therefore, it is not unnatural that the ambassadors of the Great White Brotherhood try to awaken people to strive for themselves. It is precisely because striving and self-improvement are natural to us as human beings that they have been practiced ever since the first helpers from other planets came here. To accelerate human development is to become aware of things usually hidden from us, to know what life is and what its purpose is, what all the worlds and aspects of existence it encompasses, and to become convinced that we can live after death and that the spiritual world exists. This knowledge must not be based on hearsay, but on our own will. So, the question has always been, how can one gain knowledge of the spiritual world? In the old races, one was aware of it in some way, but it was not real knowledge. It was more incidental. Just as in modern times, a medium may be inspired when a spirit being whispers something to them, but it is not real knowledge of any kind. A medium is like a child or a toy, guided by another. When we have real knowledge, it is self-conscious and personal. To become aware of all worlds, one must have an I consciousness, or a self, that is growing. This growth of the self is impossible unless that self has a body that makes it think. If we only had a body that changed its shape by a single measure for every emotion and feeling, like a plastic object, we could never become self-conscious of anything. Self-consciousness comes from being able to place ourselves outside ourselves. Therefore, we must have a physical body that has become increasingly rigid. In Atlantis, it was still completely soft, but it has gradually become more rigid. It is this physical body that makes self-consciousness possible for us. It gives us a sense of self. But this physical body does not fly into the spiritual world. The more rigid it becomes, the more it is confined to this physical world, which is as rigid and slow as it is. All forms here are rigid and hard. All nature is like frozen music. But it has the effect of making us self-conscious, even if at the same time it obliterates from us the idea of worlds in which life is different. So now the question is, how can we become aware of them? And since this physical body cannot fly to the spiritual world, nature poses the question to us, can you separate from the physical body a part that is in some way spiritual, that is other than this solid matter, and with it fly to the spiritual world? Indeed, we have such a body, the etheric body, which is the invisible side of the physical body. We could use that and go into the spiritual world. If we go without it, what does it mean? If we go to the spiritual world in the same way we go to the dream state, then we go without the etheric body. When we sleep, the physical and etheric bodies stay in bed, and we go into the spiritual world in the astral body. The result is that there is no self-consciousness in the spiritual world. For self-consciousness to be present, the physical body would also have to be present, but since this body cannot automatically enter the spiritual world, it has to be split in two. We say, one must learn to die because it is death that splits us in two. This has been a practical problem in all esoteric self-education work. How do we maintain self-consciousness in the spiritual world? It is only preserved by the etheric body, so it has to be taken out of the physical body. When we look back in time and see how the great teachers tried to guide the people of Lemuria and Atlantis, we see how the further back we go, the more powerful, simple, and clear the teacher's influence on the disciple has been. Towards the end of Lemuria and the beginning of Atlantis, when our consciousness was sleep consciousness, if we were in an esoteric school, we could learn to think more and more. We had to develop our very reason. And then, when the time came for the teacher to initiate us, they said, now you must die, go out in your etheric body. We did not know how to separate our etheric body from the physical one, but obeying the teacher's command, the etheric body went out. And as much self-consciousness as we had been able to develop in our day consciousness also went out, because it followed the etheric body. Whenever the etheric body goes out, there is consciousness either in it or possibly in the physical body, so the etheric body is split. Let's take an example. If you receive anesthesia, you breathe in ether or chloroform. When it enters the body, this foreign substance drives out the etheric body and the physical body becomes numb. Similarly, if a person becomes unconscious, some of the ether goes out. When you are anesthetized in this way, it may happen that you are yourself outside the physical body. Your consciousness goes into the etheric body. You can look at your physical body, at the doctor or the nurse, and you are happy. You look with pleasure at the whole operation because you don't know anything about pain. And then you can think, I don't care to watch that. I'm going to go out and walk. Then, once the anesthetic has worn off, you feel an attraction to the physical body and lose consciousness. The etheric body is the very thing that retains that daydream consciousness. So, this was a problem from the beginning. When we slept in Atlantis, the etheric body remained in physical contact as we moved into our own aura in the heavenly state. Therefore, if we wanted to evolve occultly, we needed to get the etheric body out of the physical. It was easy, even if we didn't know how to do it ourselves. The teacher at the initiation told us how to do it. And the initiation focused on making various observations in another world under the teacher's guidance. The usual time that the initiate spent in the other world was 3.5 days, then the teacher would wake them up again. We should note that this detachment from the etheric body becomes more difficult. The more we descend into matter, the more we progress towards the fifth root race, the more our etheric body became attached to the physical, so that it was very difficult to detach it. Even in Indian times, in the old Indian culture and its early experiences, the initiator had very great power, but then mere words were no longer enough. The initiator had to touch the initiate with the rod. The initiator had to exert a force that detached the initiate from the etheric body. We could no longer obey a mere word as in the Atlantean and Lemurian periods. Then, as we move forward in time and look at Iranian, Semitic, Egyptian and Celtic times, we see how this detachment from the etheric body becomes increasingly complex. Then the Hierophant had to put us into a magnetic, mesmeric sleep. And it wasn't just anyone. The Hierophant had to have knowledge and power. But we also discovered that in practice there were other ways. In the Celtic period, for example, the old Finns and also the Druids and many other peoples had a custom that when the etheric body of a disciple was to be removed, it was no longer enough to have the word and touch of the Hierophant alone, but there had to be a magical chain, other evolved beings around, holding hands and singing, so that the one in the middle went into a trance. There were many such cases in mysterious places in Europe thousands of years ago, and they had a significant impact. By that term Egyptian initiation, I have meant all the forms that were used during the fifth root race. But if we think of the actual Egyptian ceremonies that were used in the pyramids, the candidate was taken to a special vault where they were placed in a coffin. The priests stood around singing, and then the Hierophant made the initiate fall into a trance. Then the initiate would wake up in another world where the Hierophant would carry them and let them watch and experience all kinds of things for 3.5 days. After that time it was customary to carry the coffin to the top of the pyramid, where a balcony-like protrusion was located. When the sun rose, its rays would set some device ringing there, waking the initiate from their sleep. And because the initiate had an etheric body in another world and was consciously experiencing it, they kept the memory of it. Hence, all the writers and poets who had been initiated in the mysteries confessed that the mysteries of life and death were then known, and that the world was changed in the eyes of the initiate. They had knowledge, they were protected. This was a wonderful, miraculous event in the life of a truth-seeker. Before that, of course, there had been a long period of preparation and purification. All mysteries always speak of a preparation before a candidate can be initiated, and when they were initiated, they attained knowledge. Before, they had to believe, but in initiation they attained knowledge. This has given us a very clear idea of how important and rich in content the initiation has always been. And a person who received initiation and who had undergone a long process of purification and preparation was an extraordinarily virtuous being. You will remember, I have said this before, a sentence in the Gospel where Jesus Christ says of Nathanael, "Here truly is an Israelite in whom there is no deceit." John 1:47. Nathanael was amazed when Jesus knew him. Jesus said, "I saw you while you were still under the fig tree." John 1:48. This is occult wisdom. In Sanskrit, the fig tree is called the Bodhi tree, meaning the tree of wisdom. The Buddha attained enlightenment under the Bodhi tree. The fact that Nathanael had been under a fig tree means that Jesus said, "I saw you when you were initiated, when you were enlightened." Nathanael realized, Jesus is a wonderful being to know my most secret experience. For if one is initiated, one will not speak and boast of it. This was like a revelation to Nathanael, and he understood who Jesus was. And the initiation which was then in question was a very high achievement, for it had made Nathanael a true Israelite, which meant that he had reached a state of development in his self-consciousness, and that he was in communion with his people and their national spirit. He therefore knew the national God of the people of Judah. He was such an evolved human being that the inner spirit, the soulish aspiration of the people of Judah, could live in him. In the same way, today we can speak and mean the same thing. Well, there is a real Finn or Englishman, etc. Here is an individual who embodies the Finnish spirit and can immerse themselves in their people's spirit. In profane circles this is a vague way of saying it, but occultly, from the point of view of initiation, there are real Finns, French, English, etc., who know what lies in the spirit of their own people. Such are often the greatest poets, who are usually initiated. If a great poet is born among us who is animated by the spirit of the Finnish people, so that they can magnificently describe their spirit and aspirations, so that they awaken in us a love of the fatherland, then they are those who have been initiated into the mysteries of that very people. Eino Leino felt the spirit of the Finnish people deeply. Its spirit lived in him. He had achieved such initiation during one of his previous incarnations among the Finnish people, not necessarily here in Finland, but in the context of the Finnish tribe. He was born here, knowing that he understood these people. From his youth he felt, I love these people and I understand them. That is what Jesus meant when he described Nathanael as a true Israelite. This can be called the Old Covenant, because within its framework one achieved such things, and this national initiation was a very high achievement on that path. The question then arises, what has changed, because now we are talking about the new covenant and the new way? What has the work of Christ accomplished? When I talk about the work of Christ, I don't just mean Jesus the Nazarene's 3-year work in Palestine, but the work of the cosmic Christ, which is also the work of the mystical Christ within our earth. We can say that work began when people themselves began to strive. From our humanity, therefore, individuals were born who were striving on the path of initiation. Christ was still so far away at that time that we cannot speak of his actual work. The work of Christ did not really begin to show itself until this 5th root race, when the sonship of the Logos drew nearer and nearer to this earth, because some human individuals rose so high towards him in the invisible world. Among them was the Buddha, a great and important figure. Therefore, when I have spoken of the work of Christ, I have always mentioned the Buddha, for the work of Christ began visibly with the Buddha. The Buddha so took in the Son of God that what he spoke was absolute truth. It was the Word of God. But in the body of Jesus Christ, the cosmic Christ descended completely. Of course, the Buddha's body was perfectly pure, that is clear, otherwise he could not have received Christ in his head. If he had not been powerful and pure, the consciousness of the Son of God would have exploded his body. Only Jesus Christ could take the Son of God, Christ, into his whole body, so that it filled him completely. It is usually said that this happened at the baptism in Jordan. The way I explain it is that Jesus did have Christ in him from his previous incarnation, that he was actually the Son of God from birth, but his full consciousness was awakened at the baptism. Here we can mention, by the way, that the very work of John the Baptist was a quite remarkable work of preparation for initiation. He used a method that is still used today, and was also used in India. At the same time, he was testing people who came to him and wanted to know what life was all about. John was able to show them what life is. Therein lies his wonder as an occult teacher. And John's baptism was not like today's sprinkling a little water on the head. It was real. The one to be baptized was allowed to enter the Jordan River, and John took them by the neck and pushed them completely under the water and held them there for some time. That's what the test was. Some immediately tried to get out and couldn't stay there at all. John let them get out, but the person had not experienced anything. And it may be that such a person became John's persecutor. But to such a person, who may have been underwater while John held them, the same happened that happens in death. The etheric brain becomes a little detached from the physical body, and then the etheric memory immediately begins to work. And their whole life passes before their eyes like a film, and they judge their own life. In that experience you also know at the same time how you should be, what the purpose of life is. Just as in death one realizes, I have pursued in vain, my whole life has been wasted, or I have done the right thing in that. One then sees objectively how one should have been and how one has acted. Then one judges one's life as a judge of oneself. John put people to the test in baptism, and many saw their own lives and judged them. And then they were born again knowing what they had to do in life. It was a kind of initiatory experience, a bit like the old-time initiatory experience, although it wasn't as extensive. John could not keep a person underwater for long because the person could have died. In that state, though, time does not mean the same as it does here. A person can see thousands of years in the blink of an eye. So that was the baptism of John. And John himself testified, I baptize you with water for repentance, but after me comes one who is more powerful than I. He will baptize you with the Holy Spirit and fire. Matthew 3:11. It is like a fire. When we die in these present circumstances, it is like a lightning bolt that cuts us in two. And the teaching of initiation, both of Jesus Christ and of others, is always in the context of death. For without it, there is no resurrection. The redemptive work of Christ. We will deal with this redemptive work of Christ only from a certain occult point of view. These things are not to be arrived at by mere thought, by philosophical reflection. The points we make on the question of initiation are matters which depend on experiential knowledge. They come to us through experience in living life, and we must then explain them. All scientific work is carried out in the same way in this world. A scientist doesn't sit down to think about what the world is like and then arrives at a conclusion based on their own thoughts that such and such is visible and such laws prevail. In the Middle Ages, perhaps, that was how people made the mistake of conducting scientific research. But nowadays a scientist first looks, investigates, and then discovers how things are. They study nature and its phenomena, note them down, classify them, then draw logical conclusions and explain them. They make a synthesis only after the analysis of the phenomenon has taken place. It is the same in real, mystical, occult, esoteric life. Only when we have experienced and found that the experience is valid, that it is a recurrent experience, that it is a legal experience, do we become aware that life really exists. Only then do we attempt to understand rationally the things we have experienced and found. Only then does human activity begin. Only this enables us to digest our experience. That is why it is difficult for one to explain to oneself and to others what one knows of one's experience in spiritual matters, in the phenomena of another form of being, on another plane, and in another living reality. Therefore, such things presented in connection with occult experiences are difficult to understand. They are difficult to express in human language. But we should not be afraid of it, nor should the one who has experienced it be afraid. One knows and tries to understand and explain. We are dealing here with a question so remarkable and so revolutionary that I should like to say that even occultists disagree with it, perhaps precisely because this question of the work of Christ, which we discussed in our initiatory discourses, has not always been asked. We have talked about how today there are two ways, two covenants, the Old and the New Covenant. The Old Covenant is still in effect today, so one can walk the old initiation path that has existed since the Great White Brotherhood was founded on earth. But at the same time there is this new way opened by the work of Jesus Christ coming into the world through his life. This new way is absolutely revolutionary and fundamentally different from the old way. Only a few sages and occultists have walked this new path and lived in this new covenant. The roads do meet at a certain height, become one at a certain point, and in no way contradict each other. But Christ is attracting more and more of the old path followers to his side. This will become easier to understand as we begin to look more closely at today's subject, the initiation of the new covenant, as much as this can be described. All things become clearer and clearer when we compare them with other similar things. We thus get a clearer idea of the new covenant way of initiation when we have an idea of the old covenant way of initiation. We have talked about this in several presentations. Now we should try to describe the Christian way of initiation, the way of the new covenant. In order to obtain as clear and outwardly precise an idea as possible of the matter, and of the main features and principles which distinguish the old and new covenant ways, it is appropriate to give a brief overview of the initiation ceremonies in Egypt. I will continue to use the term Egyptian initiation in the general sense to refer to the Old Covenant initiation, although, of course, the Egyptian pyramidal initiation best describes it. What is the striking feature of an Egyptian initiation? We can say this: the Old Covenant wayfarer attained their knowledge in such a way that in initiation they were outside the body in another world, where they wandered under the guidance of a hierophant investigating the phenomena of that world. They came out of their physical body not only in their astral body, as everyone does when asleep, but also in their etheric body, which occurs naturally only when stunned or dying. Their hierophant could at the same time activate the senses in the etheric body so that when they returned to the physical body, they remembered what they had experienced. Without this recollection made possible by the hierophant through that mysterious magical touch, the initiation would not have meant much. However, experiences in the spiritual world have a moral value. For when one has an experience, as everyone does when one is outside physical body, even when one is asleep, there is always something moral, or else immoral. Since the experiences of ordinary people outside their physical bodies are not always of an elevating quality. They do not always enter the heavenly world, but may remain in the lower levels of the spiritual world, where the experiences are not morally elevating, but on the contrary arouse their lower instincts. The initiatory experience was, of course, always instructive and sublime in quality because it was conducted by a hierophant. One was able to see something which one's teacher always explained at the same time. One had knowledge of the conditions after death when one returned to one's body. The mystery of death was therefore solved for the initiate. Another striking characteristic of the Egyptian initiate was that their whole endeavor before initiation and their conception of life after initiation were, in short, a struggle against evil both within themselves and in the wider world. When a person following the way of the Old Covenant became a seeker of truth and wanted to understand what life was, the first inner admonition was, find yourself a teacher. In the Upanishads of ancient India it is said, arise, awake, and go in search of a teacher. The initiate knew instinctively that they could not find clarity on their own. They had heard that there were teachers in the pyramids who knew and could guide and advise them, and they aspired to be a student of one of those teachers. Once they had found a teacher, their task was to follow that teacher's very detailed advice. This advice was of a very strict moral quality, then increasingly esoteric and occult. They had to develop supersensory faculties. To do this, they had to practice yoga. These were breathing exercises, gymnastic exercises, exercises of concentration of thought, etc. They could only be performed under the guidance and supervision of a wise teacher. When, under a teacher's supervision, they carried out these exercises and developed the required moral qualities, they made progress along the way. A very important point, even in the quest for Egyptian initiation, was that the disciple had to lead a life of absolute purity and abstinence from sex. That was almost the first moral requirement, if we want to call it moral. This was all that the teachers of white magic demanded of their pupils. Yet it could also be the case that a person searching for a teacher did not find a white magician, but found a different kind of teacher who also promised, I can help you on your way. I can teach you to develop all kinds of abilities and show you the secrets of life and death. Such a teacher may well have made tough demands at first, but then later made the opposite, immoral demands. Then, under the guidance of such a teacher, the disciple was led down the wrong way. Let us pay no more attention to this, but concentrate on an aspirant who was on the right path. When the Egyptian initiate entered the world, their conception of life was of a very definite nature. One had to fight against evil both in oneself and in the world. One was like a soldier who had to be always ready to fight. We thus see how the ideal of the initiates of those occult circles of the old cultures and of those who went the way of the Old Covenant were different from what they may be today. They admired war, for example, and regarded participation in it as a chaste act. It was a great achievement for a person, even an initiate, to go to war or to teach others to do so and give their lives for a high cause. The concept of patriotism was not yet so clear, but one had to be able to fight and die for one's own people, one's own religion and civilization. Nor could a person be considered like the sages of old, such as Moses, if they could not fight evil in themselves and overcome their desires, lusts, and weaknesses. They could not care anything about their own sufferings. They had to kill everything in themselves that was evil. Thus, they got ahead, became a great sage, spiritually and morally elevated, by killing in themselves all that was evil. This is fundamentally the most important feature. An Old Covenant initiate always had to fight and kill. When we look at people today, when we think about ourselves and our own circumstances, we find that there is a lot of this tendency in us too. We have heard teachings like this, and we have an instinct to fight and to kill, but we know that quite a few people in our time, especially in this Christian community, have come to the conclusion that it is almost impossible for them to fight and kill all evil in themselves. At least they do not get to the point of being able to kill. They do not win in battle. It is those who try most vigorously to fight against themselves who find that one has no power to defeat oneself. Let's imagine that an old sage, Moses, or an Indian rishi, is standing in front of us. How would they make us feel if we complained that we could not kill the evil in ourselves, that the roots of sin run so deep that the more we struggle, the more sin comes into us, and that one cannot save oneself? Do you think they would say to us, yes, it is really so difficult? Not at all. But they would look at us in such a way that we would be ashamed and say, you must fight and kill in yourselves all that is not right. That is the way I have walked. Do you think that I would have become Moses and a sage if I had been afraid of adventures and battles? Certainly not. So they walked the way of the Old Covenant. Moaning and whining were out of the question. It was a silent battle of which perhaps no one knew anything. One had to fight until one's own self was killed. Only then was the fight over. I must confess that Christianity, in misunderstanding the great work of Jesus Christ, has indulged in utter spiritual laziness. If human development had progressed so far that we had even one quality left to develop in us regardless of our moral inferiority, then we would not be human. We have intelligence, reason that can develop regardless of what we are like in our character or our nature. The mind does not always develop as well as it should. It can develop into something very sharp and intelligent, and that too is an achievement. It is something that has opened up even if we neglect spiritual and moral development. In this latter respect, we live in spiritual laziness in Christianity. But we have seen that a new era has begun for humanity. We have not been able to embrace it as individuals, but we have embraced it en masse. We think that we do not need to make a moral effort. We merely adjust our intellect to believe certain things, and then we think we will be saved in a moral sense. If Moses, old Wainamoinen, or some other old wise sage were to walk among us, they would surely wonder how spiritually lazy and insignificant we are. There are no longer any real brave heroes and adventurers in the world who educate themselves in certain areas. People are like parts of a machine, of that empty hole. I no longer see individual human beings who push and strive. You just live day by day. You just go along with a life that is also criticized as empty and stupid. The old sages, looking at modern times, wonder, it is people themselves who make their lives empty and stupid. For if one calls life empty, then one is empty, devoid of moral strength. But if one has the spirit of life, the moral strength, the vigor, and the courage, then one recognizes that life is full of meaning. So says Moses as he walks among us. His criticism of Christianity is in fact quite severe. The wise men of old were not afraid to be moral. There could be no weakness in themselves. They believed in their own strength, in the triumph of a human being. And yet, when we look at an Egyptian initiate, such an old sage, we see something missing in them. They have a very austere, even limited view of life. It has been achieved by struggle. There is only peace in them that has been achieved by struggle. It is indeed noble, majestic, and great, but it is as if they have not been able to touch all the qualities of the human soul. It is as if something in us is left unstruck when we think of a wise sage like Moses, who thinks that life is so very hard and knows how much must also be demanded of an aspirant. We can feel that such wise and great sages would probably not be able to transmit melodies from heaven or be able to create music. Could they make the world resound with symphonies? It seems to us that they would prefer to demand powerful marching tunes, the blare of horns, the beat of drums, which makes people fight and kill, and forget their own weaknesses. It is as if those wise people could not open up and convey all the possibilities of beauty that lie in heaven and have come into the world through Christianity. In spite of our moral weakness, we have been able to open some new doors into the secret chambers of life, so that Christianity understands all that is beautiful, understands art more deeply than it has ever been understood before, and also understands things intellectually in a more comprehensive way. What is the secret behind it? It is the redemptive work of Christ, a strange fact difficult to explain to the intellect. It must be experienced and known firsthand. If we look at a new covenant initiate, who has experienced the mysteries of initiation in the new way, what is it about them that attracts our attention? What is it about them that is distinctive? First of all, when we contrast the Egyptian initiate with their experiences in the spiritual world, the initiate of the new covenant experiences everything in their daily life in this physical world. They do not go out of their body but remain in the physical. They do not even regard as fully valid those experiences which are made exclusively outside the physical body. There may, of course, be experiences which can only take place outside the physical body, and they must then be regarded as valid. But the experiences which were gained in the old initiations, the knowledge of the afterlife and the visions of the kingdom of the dead, must not take place outside the physical body. They must be experiences in full daytime consciousness, not just mediumistic experiences where you don't know what you are seeing. Mediumistic seeing is a faculty that arises in those with psychic tendencies. The experiences of the initiate are such that they know what they see and experience. They are completely self-conscious in everything, and in their day-to-day life, they must not now interfere with any other states of consciousness as they did before in the world, but must come to the point where everything in them is absolutely calm, self-conscious, and clear on a day-to-day level. This is the first striking difference. Then there is another important difference. The Old Covenant initiate's concept of life was still the same as it had been before the initiation, that is, fighting and killing. When we look at the New Covenant initiate, we find that they do not have to fight as hopelessly, do not have to kill, and do not have to fall into any kind of hopelessness as before. Why? Because the basic beat of one's life is victory. One must not fight, one must win. One must not kill anything in oneself. One must overcome one's weaknesses and take the forces they contain for the service of good. Therefore, the whole conception of life is quite different from what it was before. It is no longer based on the principle of fighting, but on this principle of overcoming. That is why they, like Jesus Christ and Buddha, cannot accept war and violence, because killing is not the way to victory. All the wise people of old have foreseen this as some future, remarkable achievement which even today remains only a miraculous aspiration of what lies ahead. The ordained weapon of the new covenant is the word of the wise person. Not a battle, but victory through the power of the word. And that word is the greatest weapon in the world, because words create worlds. Not by the sword and by violence, not by wiping out the old so that the new may be born, but by using the power of the word to create the new. Then astonishingly, the old then falls to its knees. There is a third characteristic and distinction. Whereas the old sage was harsh and could at best laugh at all weakness, the initiated sage of the new covenant is full of human love and understanding, full of that wonderful knowledge, which speaks to another person. If only you could see and feel, if only you could know and experience, you too would win. What is the redemptive work of Christ behind this wonderful fact? For without him, without his work, we would not be able to overcome. When in our day one begins to seek the truth, when one wakes up and wants to know what life is, then one need not worry about where to find a teacher. One need not go in search of a teacher. One can learn and hear that one can find a teacher, a master in oneself, that one can find Christ in oneself. That is a wonderful fact. The whole world and all existence can open up, and that is the achievement of Christ's work. First and second Adam. When I gave this title to my presentation, I was of course thinking of Paul's words about the two Adams. He referred to the first Adam with, just as sin entered the world through one man, Romans 5:12, and the second Adam with, life through the one man, Jesus Christ, Romans 5:17. Now I want to talk about the redemptive work of Christ in this very occult sense, in connection with initiation. We have talked about initiation under the Old Covenant, and we have also tried to discuss initiation under the New Covenant for those on the new way. But now I would like to refer, in a few words, if at all possible, to the great mystery which has given rise to Christian dogmas concerning redemption. If we see a living person and a dead person side by side, then we immediately say that the living person is distinguished from the dead by the life that works in them, the life force, as our scholars say. And our scholars limit this distinction to this living power, and in it they conceal that side of a human being which we call consciousness. We separate it from the vital force. But when we study human beings more closely in various situations, we find that this vital force in them which makes them alive is apparently not a single force. At least it appears to us in the form of various forces which are quite separate from consciousness. Hence, occultists and mystics speak of various fundamental forces operating in human beings which are outside their psychic faculties, forces which flow in their nerves and keep their bodies alive. It may be said that there is only one force, but when we look at the phenomena of life, we can, at least in our imagination, distinguish between different forces. And then, when we investigate occultly, we find that there are indeed different forces in human beings. Let us think, for example, of a sick person. A person who is ill loses vitality, it is diminished in him. But we can still see that another force may be at work in that sick person, even though the vital force is flowing out of them. It is called willpower, and it is this which moves along the nerves. By means of it, they can animate their own body, even though the vital force is failing them. When death comes, it cuts off their will. Will cannot continue indefinitely. This shows that there are different forces, because if willpower were nothing more than life force, we could ask, why then does one not want to live forever? Fate cuts their life short, they cannot use their will. If it were the same force, it would have to become willpower, but apparently it is not quite the same. And if we examine some cases, we find that there are diseases which starve a person, take away their vital force, but may increase the erotic force. Doctors know this, and they find it a very extraordinary phenomenon. This might indicate that the vital force becomes the power of love. But yes, I suppose sex drive is another, because it can be independent of life force. On the other hand, we have examples of a person who wants to concentrate on creative work and save other forces. They almost completely forget to eat, which at the same time consumes vital force and increases creative force. and they may completely forget about sexual energy. Such a phenomenon is well known in life. And in fact, we can say that these forces are apparently different in different people, and we find that their absence has different effects. If one has no vital force, one is dull. If one cannot control one's willpower, one becomes mad, insane, one's vital force is disappearing. It can then manifest itself in another way. One can become intensely sexual, or one can want to overeat. But if one lacks spirit, one becomes alien to life. If, on the other hand, we find that the vital force in one begins to fail, one becomes ill and weak, and if the sexual force begins to fail, then it is as if the charm of life is lost. One is no longer attracted to this bodily life. Then one usually begins to grow a little wiser, begins to seek wisdom, but it is a bit late. This is how the economy of nature works. Looking at life and living people, we can distinguish between the three forces. One of them is willpower. It is not the same as consciousness. I strongly want something and then it flies like an electric message into the nervous system. Some force flows in it. Then we can quite well see the second force, namely the life force, and thirdly the sex force, which is the creative force in a person. We may say that the vital force is the force which one maintains by taking care of oneself, by nourishing oneself. What is independent is the sex force, which begins at a certain age and lasts for a particular time. Thus it is apparently a different force from the vital force, since it involves a different time scale even in a healthy person. These forces appear in parallel. So, there are three forces at work in man: the spirit or will, the life force, and the creative force. And these three forces also exist from an occult point of view. But how do we know, occultly speaking, that they are different forces? By looking at their origin. Although metaphysically speaking there is nothing other than a single reality, one single consciousness, there are different forms of consciousness and different forces in manifestation. And when we look at these forces in humans and trace their origin, we find that they lie outside the person. If we first look at humans' willpower, what do we see? It is the power of our own spirit. What is our spirit? In general, it is quite unknown to us humans. Our inner spirit is divine, and as the Apostle Paul says, this divine spirit of ours searches the mysteries of God. Our spirit, which is our very self, at the same time leads us right to God. And we say of our own spirit that it is one with the Son of God, Christ and God the Father. As Jesus says in the Gospel, I am in the Father, and that the Father is in me. John 14:10. Our innermost spirit is the Son of God, as we tend to define it, and it is like a step in the consciousness of the Son of God who is one with the Father. That is the great secret of our spirit, and no one dares to tell oneself, I am the Son of God, unless one knows this within oneself and in one's own spirit. One must know the deepest roots of one's own being to be able to say, I am the Son of God. This is the origin of our divine will. But when we look at the life force, which in Sanskrit is called prana, Madame Blavatsky also uses that name, then we find that its origin is in the sun, which transmits this force to each individual via a great sea of life. When we study the sun, we find that it radiates in equal measure the magnetism of life that we humans absorb. We have in our bodies the instruments, the devices, by which we absorb that force and transform it into our individual prana. Every scientist admits that if the sun did not shine, our lot would be death. The force that sustains us and this world comes from the sun. We know from our daily experience that if the sun is overcast for too long, we humans get a little depressed, even though we don't know why. But when the sun starts shining again, it is as if a new vitality comes into us. When that vitality flows into us, it feels like life is wonderful. If we say that only with our spirit, our consciousness, can we see the truth, Christ, the Son of God, the Father and God, then we can also say that without the power of the sun, the life force, we could not feel this life. We can only feel life, existence, happiness via the power of the sun reaching us and making us feel healthy. Then we are happy in a natural way, just as the whole of nature is happy simply by virtue of its existence. After all, there are people, reformers, who speak only of this happiness, who say that we should strive to make the happiness of nature, the bliss of living, be felt in us, and that we should embrace the happiness that animates the whole of existence. If only we could absorb the power of the sun, then we could reach the summit of all life. So say such reformers. We do not limit ourselves to this because we know that there are other forces in man. Our consciousness, our spirit, in turn demands that we see the truth. As a child, we can indeed rejoice in existence. All of life can be like walking on a bed of roses for us. But when our human spirit awakens in us, then we long not only to exist, but also to see the truth, to understand existence. When we study the third power in humans, that creative power, the sex power, we find when we study it occultly, that it is very mysterious. When decades ago in my youth I tried to study this matter, I never came to anything other than the conclusion that the sex force, which can manifest itself in us as desires and lusts, making life attractive to us, cannot be a mere life force, for that force only requires that we be healthy, happy, and the spirit force needs nothing more than to see God. But that wonderful creative power manifests itself in us as a desire for some particular pleasure or thing. We human beings are, from one point of view, a little insane, as some creature coming here from another star might say. If we imagine that a being who is quite pure and sublime should come here and look at us, they would say that all people are slightly obscure and mysterious beings. They have secret passions and desires that make them children of twilight. I wondered about that in my youth, but I could not come to any other conclusion than that it is the power of the sun that is diffused in us, differentiated as if through a lens in the subconscious. In this external life, we can refract the sun's rays through a magnifying glass and then use them to light a fire. In the same way, I thought that in we humans there is something like a big lens that collects the sun's forces, transforming them into a kind of heat that becomes the sexual force. The longing to live is turned into a sexual force. The sun's force is turned into prana, which is converted into heat and then rages in us. This is what I thought in my youth because I did not know how to study this sexual force in humans as a special third force. And when we philosophize in our youth, we always want to achieve unity. There should be only one truth. We become more humble as we get older and no longer demand theories as we did when we were young. As I've got older, I've been able to see and understand that this sex force is really a third force that originated outside of us. Just as the power of our spirit comes from God the Father and the life force from the Logos, the Sun, so the sex force comes from this earth. This is a mysterious, miraculous, occult observation. This third power in us is a strange and obscure power which comes from the bowels of our globe. For in the midst of our globe there is a spirit, an angel, if we look at things as they were tens of thousands of years ago. This spirit is not imprisoned here but may dwell elsewhere. This place is a study where it spends much time and gathers the power of the sun. So, I was partly right in my youth to think of some miraculous lenses, but that lens factory existed at the center of the earth, where the power of the sun is converted into consuming and miraculous creative fire. Moses was told, "The Lord your God is the one who goes across ahead of you like a devouring fire." Deuteronomy 9-3. The spirit of earth transforms the power of the sun into creative power and sends it to all creatures. We live in an atmosphere of creative electricity, of magnetism, and we have this creative force flowing into us from within the earth. You will remember what I have sometimes said in my lectures, and what Madame Blavatsky also discusses in her Secret Doctrine, that in ancient times the spirit of the earth was also called Saturn or Satan. It is just like Satan's fireplace, his isolated miraculous stable, which also provides us with fire. And the fire that we have been given down the ages from the time we got physical bodies and split into two sexes has always been manifested in us as the sex force. And we can see that this sex force has caused all the misfortunes, conflicts, sorrows, and difficulties in humanity. No wonder religion calls it the fall, because its arrival brought sin into the world and released the power of Satan that made us suffer so much. That power comes to us from within the earth, and that power has not generally manifested itself in humanity as anything other than sexual power. In other words, by making Satan and Satan's government powerful in the world. It has been going on for millions of years, and its power remains great. Initiates of the mysteries and the Great White Brotherhood have also always known that Satan's power can be broken, that one must overcome Satan, that one must refuse to serve him, and that one can then bring out the hidden power in another way. It has always been known that this power of Satan in us has not manifested itself perfectly. When it is only as a sexual power, it is only a small part of it. It is not the power itself at all. For the power is quite different. It is the very creative power of the world, which is hidden in every person because it is hidden in our earth. As we have said, this has been known by all the wise and knowledgeable. Hence, the initiation, the passage along the secret way, has been designed to bring that power under human control, to make one the master of the creative power, and at the same time to trample Satan under one's feet. When we look at the Old Covenant way and the initiators and hierophants of the ancient cultures and mysteries and esoteric schools, we see how they always tried to awaken this power in their students in the initiation. They called this power the mother of the world, the Kundalini, the serpent power. This Kundalini or serpent fire lies at the base of the human spine, radiating to the human sex organs, but otherwise sleeps as a snake within the human being, like the tree of life at the center of the earth. It was this serpentine fire that the Magi were trying to awaken in their students. And we too have seen how in ancient cultures, for example, among the old Atlanteans, this power, suddenly awakened in its entirety, enhanced one's sexuality excessively. That fire, when awakened, thus went along the pathway which had already been opened, and thus increased the sexual force immensely. And this power was then used by these people for black magic, not only for sexuality. If that fire were now indiscriminately awakened and unleashed, one would not only become a satyr, uncontrolled with one's sexuality, but it would also lead one to black magic. That is why people everywhere who are trying to develop spiritually and psychically are always warned, do not go about awakening the snake fire in yourself. If you do, the happiest thing is to become insane. Therefore, in the old cultures, only under the supervision of a wise teacher, a sage, could a disciple do anything that would awaken a snake fire in him, and then the hierophant would try to guide it in the etheric body. We have talked about how we can use the etheric body to become self-aware in another world. To become conscious of the other world in this day and age, as has been discussed, it is always required that, in the etheric body, various centers of consciousness be awakened, which are connected with our daytime brains, so that we achieve supersensible powers through the etheric body. And this is how, in ancient cultures, these human conscious abilities, the abilities to see into another world, to influence and explore things in another world, were awakened in the etheric body by means of a snake fire, by the awakening of centers of consciousness, which in Sanskrit are called chakras or lotus flowers in modern terminology. The Finnish sages use the term sampo. There are 12 of these etheric chakras, and they must be put into operation. Of those that could be awakened is the chakra at the navel, the solar plexus. This chakra then comes into contact with the plexus solaris nerve. And then at the forehead, between the eyes, there is another chakra, by means of which a person becomes clairvoyant. And when this chakra was awakened, the memory of what they experienced and did in the other world when they passed out of the body was awakened in them. Both these chakras were awakened in the ancient mystery ceremonies. There were several kinds of initiations, but an individual who had come a long way could see and experience the spiritual world and remember everything. One was so advanced in one's day consciousness that one could make inquiries in the invisible world. However, the ancient mysteries could take the initiate only so far. There were terrible difficulties on that path. It was a constant struggle against psychic and all other forces, and the sage of that age was stern, firm and exacting, and like Moses, without pity but full of goodwill. So now we can say that through the first Adam, the original man, when humanity fell into sin, when the sexes were formed, and the serpent fire was put into humans, all this sin and Satan's power came into the world. But as we have discussed before in these presentations, through Jesus Christ came redemption. The occult, redemptive work of Jesus Christ allowed Christ to enter into humanity and the earth. The consciousness of the Son of God had been waiting all along to enter humanity and the earth. Then a wonderful thing happened. The Christ consciousness descended and joined our earth, trampled Satan under its feet and awakened him, released him from his chains so that the spirit of our earth received a higher self. The spirit of our earth is no longer Satan but Christ. The spirit of our earth has a divine self, a higher self. Satan's long denial of millions and millions of years was wonderfully rewarded when we had come so far that we could open the gates to Christ, who was the higher self of our earth spirit. And that was the great initiation of our earth. Since then, it has begun a new life. So now it is not necessarily the fire of the earth nor the serpent fire in man that has Satan's powers hidden in it and connected to it, but the Holy Spirit of God. The Holy Spirit of God is now radiating out. And in every human being is hidden the infinitely great world-creating power of this Holy Spirit. Sexual power is now the power of the Holy Spirit in us. So now, in this new covenant and in this initiation, the power of the Holy Spirit must be awakened in us. And the serpent's fire, the kundalini, which before was the power of Satan in us when it was awakened, is now, if it is awakened in us by Christ, the power of the Holy Spirit. And where does it appear? It is seen and felt in man, for example, when the kundalini is awakened and in the twinkling of an eye, it frees one from all sexuality. When the power of the Holy Spirit awakens and operates, one is freed from the power of sex. And that kundalini, as Jesus says, has become that light which shines in the darkness, that fire which shines and of which Jesus' words esoterically mean, as long as there is light in you, walk. The light in you is hidden in the serpent fire, but let it rise into light. That serpent fire is in you as long as you are here physically, and it must be awakened in this life, but it cannot be awakened by any but Christ. Jesus Christ awakens that fire in us, and then he baptizes us, as John said, with spirit and fire. You remember how John made them aware of their spirit beings. When he immersed them in water, if they were ready, a process took place which otherwise takes place in death. They saw and were able to judge their whole life. In death, we judge ourselves objectively without any emotion. In the same way, John, when he baptized people, awakened in them a spiritual experience. But the kingdom of heaven does not come to us except through the baptism of Jesus Christ with spirit and fire. In the baptism of fire, Jesus Christ awakens in us the serpent's fire as a great light, in which we then live and shine. And in that light, by means of that fire, all the necessary chakras in the etheric body are brought into action. And the chakra first activated by Christ is the heart chakra, the lotus flower. Then, gradually, the others are also awakened. But one need not take care of that oneself. One cannot and must not do that, but always overcome oneself. One must not strive to attain powers, but in eternal joy and humility, one must be content to be without them all, if that is the Father's will, for his will alone is decisive in one's life. This is the end of the way of initiation. Thank you.